Flight 370, the plane that vanished. Imagine boarding a plane for a routine overnight flight. You settle into your seat, close your eyes, and drift off as the engines hum beneath you. 6 hours later, you should wake up in Beijing. Instead, you wake up nowhere. You're simply gone, erased from the sky. No wreckage, no answers, no closure. This is not a thought experiment. This happened to 239 people on March 8th, 2014. And 10 years later, we still do not know why. The night everything changed. The air in Kuala Lumpur International Airport hung thick and humid on that March evening. Passengers filtered through the gate for Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, a red-eye service to Beijing Capital International Airport. Most were Chinese nationals heading home. Others were international travellers connecting through Beijing to destinations beyond. The Boeing 777 that would carry them sat gleaming under the airport lights. Registration number 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. Nearly £400,000 of aircraft, fuel, cargo and human life. Among the passengers was Philip Wood, an American executive working for IBM in Beijing. He had texted his partner before boarding, talking about plans for the summer, about maybe finally taking that vacation to Thailand they had been discussing. There was Wang Linshi, a 50-year-old calligraphy artist returning from an exhibition in Kuala Lumpur. His daughter was pregnant with his first grandchild. He carried a small carved wooden box in his carry-on, a gift he had spent weeks searching for. There were 23 employees of Freescale Semiconductor, engineers and technicians heading home after a week of technical training. They joked about the late departure time as they boarded, making plans to sleep through the flight. None of them knew they had approximately 1 hour and 38 minutes left to exist in the known world. At 12:41 in the morning local time, the wheels lifted off Malaysian soil. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old with 18,000 hours of flight experience, commanded the aircraft. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27, sat beside him. Everything proceeded normally. The plane climbed into the darkness, turning northeast toward the South China Sea. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers reclined their seats. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering blankets and confirming seat belts. The cockpit was quiet. Routine. The autopilot system had already taken over the majority of flying tasks. The aircraft knew where it needed to go. All the pilots had to do was monitor, supervise and wait for Beijing to appear on the horizon in 5.5 hours. Air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur handed the flight off to Vietnamese airspace. At 1:19 in the morning, a voice from the cockpit transmitted the standard acknowledgement. Good night, Malaysian 37. 0. Routine words. Calm. Professional. Nothing to suggest what would happen next. 2 minutes later, at 1:21, the aircraft's transponder went silent. A transponder is not a luxury item. It is the voice that tells the world where you are, who you are, and how high you are flying. When it stops transmitting, the aircraft becomes a ghost. Controllers in Vietnam waited for Flight 370 to appear on their screens. It never did. They called Malaysian Air Traffic Control. Has the flight left your airspace? Yes, came the reply. It should be with you now. But it was not with anyone. For several minutes, controllers assumed it was a technical glitch. Transponders fail. Radios malfunction. It happens. They waited for the blip to reappear, for the pilots to call in with a problem report, for something normal to explain the absence. The minutes stretched. The silence deepened. And somewhere over the dark waters of the South China Sea, 239 people continued flying into oblivion. The turn. What happened next would become the foundation for every theory, every sleepless night, every conspiracy that followed. At 1:21, the moment the transponder died, the aircraft did not fall from the sky. It did not explode. It did not vanish into the ocean. Instead, it turned. A deliberate, calculated turn. Not the panicked manoeuvre of a pilot fighting for control, but the smooth banking arc of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The turn was precise. It occurred at the exact moment when responsibility for the aircraft was transferring between Malaysian and Vietnamese air traffic control. In that brief window, when neither controller was actively watching, the plane pivoted. It was the kind of timing that suggests either meticulous planning or extraordinary coincidence, and coincidences of that magnitude do not happen often in aviation. Military radar, which does not rely on transponders, tracked the aircraft as it reversed course. It flew back across the Malay Peninsula, threading through the border between Malaysian and Thai airspace. This corridor, the boundary between two countries, is monitored by both nations but actively controlled by neither. It is a seam in the radar coverage, a gap where an aircraft can fly without triggering immediate alerts. The plane followed this seam as though following a map. It passed directly over Malaysia at cruising altitude, over towns and cities where people slept, over the capital where government buildings sat dark and empty. No fighter jets scrambled to intercept. No alarm systems triggered. The aircraft was invisible to civilian radar and ignored by military systems that assumed it was an authorised flight. By 2:22 in the morning, it had travelled hundreds of miles in the wrong direction, heading northwest toward the Andaman Sea, and it was still flying. This was not a malfunction. This was a plan. The aircraft continued on this northwestern heading for approximately another hour. It flew over the Andaman Sea, that vast stretch of water between Thailand and India. Ships below saw nothing. Fishermen pulling nets in the darkness had no idea a commercial airliner was passing overhead. The plane was alone, cut off from communication, invisible to tracking systems, moving with purpose toward a destination no one could identify. Then, somewhere over the ocean, it turned again. This time, south. A long, sweeping arc that would take it away from all commercial flight paths, away from land, away from any place where people might notice. The Indian Ocean stretched before it, millions of square kilometres of empty water, and the aircraft pointed itself toward the void. At 8:11 that morning, nearly 7 hours after takeoff, a satellite owned by the British telecommunications company in Muscat registered a final automatic handshake with the aircraft. The plane's communication system, even with the transponder disabled, continued sending hourly pings to the satellite network. These pings did not contain location data, but engineers could analyse the signal to estimate distance and direction. The mathematics pointed to one conclusion. The aircraft had flown south, deep into the Indian Ocean, far beyond any possible landing site. Then silence, absolute and final. The search for ghosts. When dawn broke over the South China Sea on March 8th, families waiting at Beijing Airport knew something had gone wrong. Flight 370 had not arrived. It had not diverted. It had simply failed to exist. The arrival board showed the flight as delayed, then cancelled, then removed entirely. Airline representatives appeared, their faces carefully neutral, and began escorting family members to private rooms. They offered water, tissues, and apologies for the lack of information. They could not say where the plane was because they did not know. Vietnamese search and rescue teams scrambled aircraft and ships to scour the waters between Malaysia and Vietnam. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no emergency beacons. The ocean surface remained pristine, as though the plane had never been there. They expanded the search area, thinking perhaps the aircraft had deviated slightly from its flight plan. They checked islands, coastlines, shallow waters where wreckage might be visible from the air. Nothing. For days, the search focused on the wrong ocean. Authorities assumed the aircraft had gone down somewhere near its intended flight path. It was a reasonable assumption. Planes do not turn around and fly backward. They do not disable their communication systems and navigate using military radar gaps. Ships crisscrossed the South China Sea. Aircraft flew grid patterns until their fuel tanks ran dry. International teams from China, Australia, Malaysia, and the United States poured resources into the effort. They were searching for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was the size of a small country and the needle was made of aluminum that sinks. The media descended. Reporters from every major news organisation converged on Kuala Lumpur and Beijing. They interviewed aviation experts, radar specialists and former pilots. Everyone had theories. Some suggested mechanical failure. Others pointed to terrorism. A few mentioned hijacking. But without wreckage, without bodies, without any physical evidence, every explanation was speculation dressed up as analysis. On March 24th, Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak held a press conference. His face carried the weight of impossible news. Based on satellite analysis, he announced, Flight 370 had ended its journey in the southern Indian Ocean west of Perth, Australia. There were no survivors. The plane had flown for hours in the opposite direction of its destination before running out of fuel and plunging into one of the most remote stretches of water on Earth. The families in Beijing erupted. Some collapsed. Others screamed. A few attacked the airline representatives, demanding proof, demanding explanations, demanding that someone tell them how a plane could simply disappear in the age of satellites and GPS and global connectivity. The Malaysian government offered condolences. They promised a full investigation. They assured everyone that the truth would be found. But the truth was already drowning in miles of seawater, and no one knew where to look. The search shifted. Australian authorities coordinated the largest maritime search operation in history. Ships equipped with sophisticated sonar systems dragged towfish across the ocean floor, scanning an area that eventually exceeded 120,000 square kilometres. The technology was impressive. Side-scan sonar that could image the ocean bottom in stunning detail. Autonomous underwater vehicles that could dive deeper than any human and stay down for days. Magnetometers that detected metal from miles away. They mapped underwater mountains, discovered new marine species, and found shipwrecks that had been lost for centuries. But they did not find Flight 370. The search vessels operated in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The Indian Ocean is not gentle. Waves reached heights that dwarfed the ships. Storms rolled through with violence that shut down operations for days at a time. Crew members lived in cramped quarters, staring at sonar screens for hours, watching the ocean floor scroll past in grainy monochrome. Every anomaly triggered excitement. Every rock formation that looked slightly out of place became a potential lead. They would mark the coordinates, send down an underwater vehicle to investigate, and find nothing but geology and marine life. The operation cost more than $160 million. It involved multiple nations, dozens of ships, and thousands of personnel. It continued for nearly 3 years. In January of 2017, the search was officially suspended. The families of the missing were left with condolences and questions. The ocean had swallowed an entire aircraft and it was not giving it back. Fragments of proof. Then the ocean began to speak, one piece at a time. In July of 2015, Johnny Baig, a municipal worker on Reunion Island, was cleaning a beach on the eastern shore. It was routine work. Trash washed ashore constantly. Plastic bottles, fishing nets, debris from ships passing through the Indian Ocean shipping lanes. But this piece was different. It was large, maybe 6 feet long, covered in barnacles and algae. The metal underneath showed through in places, along with what looked like identifying numbers. Begay called the authorities. Within hours, aviation experts arrived. They photographed the object from every angle. They documented the barnacle growth, the corrosion patterns, the way the metal had torn. Then they loaded it onto a plane and flew it to France, where specialists at a facility outside Toulouse would examine it in a climate-controlled laboratory. It was a flaperon, part of the wing structure used to control the aircraft during landing. The serial numbers matched. It came from 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. It came from Flight 370. The discovery changed everything. It proved the aircraft had not been hidden on some remote island or secret military base. It had crashed. It had broken apart. And the currents of the Indian Ocean had been slowly distributing the wreckage for over a year. But the flaperon also raised questions. It showed evidence of high-speed impact, but not catastrophic destruction. The way it had separated from the wing suggested the aircraft had hit the water hard, but perhaps not as violently as a straight nosedive would produce. Some experts argued this indicated a controlled ditching attempt. Others said it proved nothing beyond the fact that the plane had crashed. Over the following months, more fragments appeared. A piece of wing washed ashore in Mozambique in February of 2016. Interior panelling from the cabin turned up on Madagascar a month later. A section of engine cowling arrived on the coast of Tanzania. Each fragment carried the signature marks of the missing Boeing 777. The Indian Ocean had been slowly digesting the wreckage for years, and now it was offering proof that the aircraft had indeed met its end in those waters. Beachcombers became amateur investigators. People walking coastlines across the Western Indian Ocean began looking for debris. They found fragments of composite material, pieces of what might have been seat components, scraps of metal that could have come from anywhere. The Malaysian government established protocols for reporting finds. Each piece was documented, photographed and analysed. Some were confirmed as coming from Flight 370. Others were from different aircraft, different accidents, different tragedies that the ocean had also claimed, but the fragments raised as many questions as they answered. Why only small pieces? Where was the main wreckage? Where were the flight data recorders, the black boxes that could explain everything? The pieces that had washed ashore represented less than 1% of the aircraft's total mass. A 777 weighs over 300,000 pounds empty. What had been recovered could fit in a cargo van. The rest remained hidden somewhere beneath miles of water. Ocean current experts studied the drift patterns. They built computer models simulating how debris would move through the Indian Ocean. They factored in wind, surface currents, deep ocean circulation patterns, and the Coriolis effect. The model suggested that if debris had appeared on Reunion Island in July of 2015, the crash site must be farther north and east than the official search area. The plane might have come down closer to Madagascar, not off the coast of Australia. If true, the entire 3-year search had been conducted in the wrong ocean. The ships had dragged their sonar arrays over the wrong sea floor. The underwater vehicles had photographed the wrong underwater mountains, and Flight 370 remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and undiscovered. The official conclusion: in July of 2018, the Malaysian government released its final report on the disappearance. The document ran to hundreds of pages. It contained radar data, satellite analysis, maintenance records, and biographical profiles of the crew. It examined the cargo manifest, passenger lists, and airport security footage. It included testimony from air traffic controllers, statements from family members, and technical assessments from aviation engineers. The conclusions were careful, measured, and ultimately unsatisfying. The aircraft had been manually diverted from its flight path by a person or persons unknown in the cockpit. The communication systems had been deliberately disabled. The transponder did not fail. Someone turned it off. The OCAR system, which transmits engine performance data, was also disabled. Someone went through the cockpit overhead panel and systematically shut down every system that would allow the outside world to track the aircraft. This required knowledge, access, and time. It was not the action of hijackers forcing their way into the cockpit. It was the methodical work of someone who belonged there. The plane had flown on for hours under human control before fuel exhaustion caused it to descend into the ocean. The final satellite handshake suggested the aircraft was in a rapid descent, possibly unpowered. Whether this descent was controlled or resulted from the aircraft simply falling out of the sky after running out of fuel could not be determined. Then came the admission that stripped away any sense of closure. The team is unable to determine the real cause for the disappearance, the report stated. We cannot exclude the possibility that there was unlawful interference by a third party. In other words, after 4 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the largest search in aviation history, the official answer was this: we do not know. Someone did something, and we cannot tell you who or why. It was an invitation for speculation, an open door through which every conspiracy theory, every alternative explanation, and every buried suspicion could walk. The captain and the flight simulator. Zahari Ahmad Shah had been flying for Malaysian Airlines since 1981. He was not a rookie. He was not erratic. Colleagues described him as professional, calm, and deeply knowledgeable. He had logged 18,000 flight hours, the kind of experience that turns piloting into muscle memory. He was a father, a husband, and an aviation enthusiast who built a full flight simulator in his home. The simulator was not a toy. It was a sophisticated setup using commercial software and professional-grade controls. He used it to practice approaches to difficult airports, to explore scenery, and to refine his skills. After the disappearance, Malaysian investigators seized the simulator. Forensic analysts recovered deleted files from the hard drive. What they found sent a chill through the investigation. Among the saved flight plans was a route that flew south into the Indian Ocean, continuing until fuel exhaustion. The flight path matched almost exactly the satellite data showing where the real aircraft had gone. The simulator data showed coordinates that aligned with the presumed crash site. The flight profile showed an aircraft flying for hours, far beyond any normal route, until the fuel gauges read 0. It was as though someone had been planning, testing, rehearsing for the exact scenario that unfolded on March 8th. Had Zahari rehearsed his own suicide mission? The evidence seemed damning. He had the skill to disable every communication system on the aircraft. He had the knowledge to exploit radar gaps and international airspace boundaries. He knew the exact moment to turn off the transponder, the precise corridor to fly through to avoid detection, and the fuel calculations needed to reach the most remote part of the Indian Ocean. If anyone could make a 777 vanish, it was him. Investigators dug deeper into his personal life. They interviewed friends, family members, and colleagues. They examined his financial records, his political affiliations, and his social media activity. They found a man who seemed, by all accounts, content. His marriage had its problems, but what marriage does not after decades? His finances were stable. He was respected at work and liked by those who knew him. He had no terminal illness, no crushing debt, no scandal that would drive someone to desperate action. Some pointed to his support for Malaysian opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, who had been convicted of sodomy charges just hours before the flight departed. Zahari had attended political rallies. He had posted on social media about government corruption and judicial overreach. Could he have been so enraged by the verdict that he decided to make a political statement written in jet fuel and ocean water? The theory felt strained. Even if he opposed the government, why kill hundreds of innocent people? Why leave no message explaining his actions? Political protesters want attention. They want their grievances heard. A protest without a statement is not a protest. It is simply murder. And mass murder without explanation is the action of someone who has abandoned all connection to the human community. But there was another interpretation of the simulator data. Pilots run unusual scenarios all the time. They practice emergency procedures. They explore what-if situations. What if all engines failed over the ocean? What if communication systems went dead? What if you had to ditch in water? Running these scenarios in a simulator is precisely what a conscientious, skilled pilot would do. It is preparation, not planning. And the fact that one scenario happened to match the actual flight path could be coincidence. Or it could be proof. The investigation could not decide. They presented the evidence and left the conclusion ambiguous. Zahari remained Schrödinger's pilot, simultaneously innocent and guilty until someone opened the black box that would collapse the uncertainty into fact. But the black box was somewhere on the ocean floor and no one could find it. The ghost in the machine. The Boeing 777 is not just an aircraft. It is a flying computer network. Every system, From navigation to engine performance feeds data through digital channels. The plane talks to the ground, to satellites, to its own internal components. It is monitored, measured, and managed by software. Hundreds of computers coordinate to keep the aircraft in the air. And where there are computers, there are vulnerabilities. In the years following 9/11, engineers developed concepts for remote flight recovery systems. The idea was simple and compelling. If hijackers took control of an aircraft, a signal from the ground could override the cockpit and fly the plane to safety. Passengers and crew would be protected. Hijackers would be neutralized. Terrorism in the sky would become impossible. Boeing filed patents for such technology. The concepts included encrypted communication links that could take control of flight systems, override manual inputs from the cockpit, and land the aircraft at a predetermined safe location. Honeywell explored similar systems. The goal was noble, but the implications were terrifying. If you can override a hijacker, you can override anyone. If you can remotely control a plane for good, you can remotely control it for anything. Conspiracy theorists latched onto this. What if Flight 370 was not diverted by the pilots, but by someone else? What if a cyber intrusion, a military override, or a classified program took control of the aircraft and flew it to a location the public was never meant to discover? The sudden loss of the transponder, the deliberate course change, the hours of silent flight through radar gaps all fit the profile of external interference. Think about the sequence of events. At 1:21 in the morning, multiple systems went dark simultaneously. The transponder stopped transmitting. The ACARS data link cut off. The radio went silent. For all of these systems to fail at once would require either catastrophic damage to the aircraft or deliberate action by someone with intimate knowledge of the plane's architecture. But there was no evidence of catastrophic damage. The plane kept flying. If someone in the cockpit was responsible, they would have needed to know exactly which circuit breakers to pull, which switches to flip, and which systems to disable in what order. They would have needed to do this while maintaining control of the aircraft, avoiding detection, and navigating through some of the most monitored airspace in the world. It is possible. Pilots train for emergencies that require quickly disabling systems, but the precision and timing suggest something more than emergency response. It suggests planning. But what if the actions came from outside the cockpit? What if someone accessed the aircraft's systems remotely and took control? The Boeing 777 does have data links that allow ground personnel to communicate with the aircraft's computers. These links are used for routine maintenance monitoring and software updates. They are encrypted and secured, but encryption can be broken and security can be bypassed. In the years since Flight 370 disappeared, security researchers have demonstrated vulnerabilities in aviation systems. They have shown how spoofing GPS signals can confuse navigation systems. They have hacked into in-flight entertainment networks and accessed deeper aircraft systems. They have proven that the digital architecture of modern aircraft, while sophisticated, is not impenetrable. The region through which Flight 370 flew is not empty airspace. It includes military zones monitored by multiple nations. Thailand operates radar installations that track everything moving through their airspace. India has air defense networks covering the Andaman Sea. The United States maintains signals intelligence facilities throughout the region. If the aircraft was hijacked remotely, those governments would have known. Their systems would have detected unusual communications, anomalous radar tracks or electronic signatures indicating a cyber operation. And if they knew, their silence becomes part of the cover-up. It transforms the disappearance from a tragedy into an act of war or espionage, or some classified operation that cannot be acknowledged without exposing capabilities the public is not meant to know exist. But there is a problem. No evidence exists that remote override technology was ever installed on 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. The systems were theoretical, not operational. Boeing and Malaysian Airlines both confirmed that the aircraft lacked any such capability. Hacking into a plane mid-flight would require exploiting vulnerabilities that had never been demonstrated in a real-world scenario outside of controlled research environments. It is possible in the way that many things are technically possible, but that does not make it probable. Still, the theory persists because it answers the unanswerable. If human error or pilot suicide seems too simple, and if mechanical failure does not fit the facts, then external interference becomes the explanation that fills the void. It transforms a tragedy into a crime, and crimes have perpetrators. Crimes can be solved. Someone can be held accountable. The alternative, that chaos simply reached up and snatched 239 people out of existence, offers no one to blame and no path to justice. The island, no one admits exists. There is a place in the Indian Ocean that does not appear on most commercial maps. Diego Garcia, a coral atoll in the Chagos archipelago, leased by the British to the United States military. It hosts one of the most secretive and strategically important military installations on the planet. Long-range bombers operate from its runways. Nuclear submarines resupply at its docks. Intelligence operations launch from its secure facilities. Detainees captured in the War on Terror have been held there, far from lawyers and oversight, and it lies within fuel range of the last known position of Flight 370. The atoll is small, barely visible on most maps, but its strategic value is enormous. Diego Garcia sits at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean, positioned perfectly to project military power across Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. The base is so sensitive that even acknowledging operations there requires security clearances most military personnel will never obtain. What happens on Diego Garcia stays on Diego Garcia. Online researchers began connecting dots almost immediately after the disappearance. What if the aircraft did not crash? What if it was intercepted after entering restricted airspace and forced to land at Diego Garcia? The theory gained traction for several reasons. First, a controlled landing would explain the lack of debris in the initial search area. If the plane landed intact, there would be no wreckage floating in the South China Sea. The weeks of fruitless searching would make perfect sense. They were looking for something that had never crashed. Second, the US military had the capability to track and intercept an aircraft operating in that region. Diego Garcia has radar coverage extending for hundreds of miles. They would have seen Flight 370 coming. They would have known it was off course, unresponsive to radio calls, and heading toward restricted airspace. Standard protocols would require an intercept. Fighter jets would have been scrambled. The aircraft would have been visually identified, and if it entered the exclusion zone around Diego Garcia without authorization, the military would have options ranging from forced landing to shooting it down. Third, the base's extreme secrecy meant that any operation conducted there would remain hidden from public view. If the aircraft landed on Diego Garcia, the passengers could be detained indefinitely. The plane could be hidden in a hangar or dismantled, evidence could be controlled, and the official story could be whatever the governments involved decided it should be. Supporters of the theory pointed to anomalies. Some claim that satellite imagery from the night of the disappearance showed unusual activity at Diego Garcia. Commercial satellites do not typically photograph military bases, but some amateur satellite trackers reported that imaging satellites passed over the atoll around the time Flight 370 would have been in the area. The images were not released publicly, which conspiracy theorists took as confirmation that something was being hidden. Others noted that several passengers aboard the flight had connections to technology or defence industries. The Freescale semiconductor employees, for instance, worked on cutting-edge chip designs used in military applications. What if one of them was carrying sensitive information? What if the entire aircraft was intercepted to prevent that information from reaching China? It would be an extreme measure, but for information valuable enough, extreme measures might be justified. The theory gained further traction when a passenger aboard the flight, Philip Wood, allegedly sent a text message and photo after the plane disappeared. The metadata from the photo, according to claims circulating online, showed GPS coordinates placing it at Diego Garcia. The image itself was black, as though taken from inside a dark room or while the phone was concealed. The accompanying message claimed he had been drugged, was being held captive, and did not know where he was. Tech experts quickly debunked the claim. The metadata was fabricated. The message was a hoax. But the story spread faster than the debunking, and for many it became evidence of a cover-up, but the theory requires a conspiracy so vast it strains credibility. It would mean the United States, Malaysia, Australia, China, and multiple other governments coordinated a cover-up involving thousands of personnel. Air traffic controllers, radar operators, satellite analysts, search and rescue teams, investigators, and journalists would all need to be complicit or deceived. It would mean families grieving for their loved ones were lied to for years. It would mean wreckage was planted on beaches across the Indian Ocean to support a false narrative. And for what? To hide the capture of one aircraft? To conceal the detention of 239 people who would never be allowed to? Contact the outside world again? To protect information that could have been seized on the ground before the plane ever took off? The operational complexity and political risk of such a scheme far outweigh any conceivable benefit. The United States denied any involvement. The Malaysian government found no evidence supporting the theory. No whistleblowers emerged. No satellite photos confirmed the claims. Diego Garcia's logs, according to official statements, showed no record of Flight 370 ever approaching the base. And yet the theory endures because Diego Garcia represents the ultimate black box, a place where secrets go to hide, a location where the impossible becomes plausible simply because no one can prove otherwise. The cargo that should not have been there. Every flight carries baggage, freight and cargo that passengers never see. Flight 370 was no exception. The manifest listed 221 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries and 2.5 tons of electronics equipment shipped by Motorola. On the surface, this seems routine. Airlines transport batteries and electronics constantly. But the details raised questions. Lithium batteries are dangerous. They store energy in a volatile chemical form that can ignite under the right conditions. Overheating, physical damage, or manufacturing defects can trigger thermal runaway, a chain reaction where the battery heats itself to combustion. Once a lithium fire starts, it is nearly impossible to extinguish. Water does not work. Conventional fire extinguishers are ineffective. The fire burns until the chemical fuel is exhausted, releasing toxic gases and intense heat. Aviation regulators impose strict limits on how lithium batteries are packaged and transported. They must be individually protected, stored in fireproof containers, and limited in quantity per shipment. If the batteries on Flight 370 were improperly packed, they could have started a fire in the cargo hold. A fire could explain the sudden communication failures. Smoke and heat would incapacitate the crew. The aircraft on autopilot would continue flying until the fire consumed critical systems or the fuel ran out. Several fatal crashes have been caused by cargo fires. In 2010, UPS Airlines Flight 6 crashed in Dubai after a fire in the cargo hold filled the cockpit with smoke. The crew declared an emergency, but by the time they attempted to land, both pilots were incapacitated. The aircraft crashed short of the runway. Investigation revealed that lithium batteries in the cargo had ignited. Could the same thing have happened to Flight 370? The timeline seems to fit. The transponder went dark at 1:21. A fire could have been burning for several minutes before that, filling the cargo hold with smoke. The crew might have noticed warnings, declared an emergency to air traffic control, and then been cut off as the fire destroyed communication systems. The turn back toward Malaysia would make sense. They were trying to return to Kuala Lumpur for an emergency landing, but this theory has a fatal flaw. The satellite data proves the aircraft flew for nearly 7 hours after the transponder went dark. A cargo fire severe enough to disable communications would have destroyed the plane within minutes, not hours. The fire would have burned through control cables, hydraulic lines, and structural components. The aircraft would have become uncontrollable and crashed in the South China Sea, not the Indian Ocean. And the deliberate course change, The precise navigation through radar gaps suggests human intent, not a crew desperately fighting a fire. Other researchers focused on the nature of the cargo itself. What was Motorola shipping? The manifest listed the items as electronics, but provided no specifics. Customs documents showed weights that did not quite match the manifest. Some components were listed as radio equipment, others were described as accessories. The vagueness invited speculation. Some theorised that the cargo included sensitive technology or intelligence materials being transported to China. Semiconductor components, encrypted communications devices, prototypes of military hardware. If true, could a foreign power have intercepted the aircraft to seize the cargo? Could the plane have been shot down to prevent the technology from reaching its destination? These theories collapse under scrutiny. Shooting down a civilian airliner to stop a shipment of electronics is not how intelligence agencies operate. It is too public, too messy, and too risky. If a government wanted to intercept cargo, they would do it on the ground, at the airport, before the plane ever took off. Customs inspections, security screenings, and freight audits provide ample opportunity to examine cargo without resorting to aircraft interception. And even if someone did shoot down Flight 370, the debris would have been found. A missile strike leaves evidence. Wreckage does not fly 7 hours south and then gently scatter itself across the Indian Ocean. Missile fragments would be embedded in the debris. Chemical residues from the warhead would be detectable. Radar systems across multiple countries would have tracked the missile launch and impact. The cargo conspiracy persists because the manifest documents remain incomplete. Conflicting reports about weights and contents fuel suspicion. When governments cannot provide clear answers about what was on the plane, people assume they are hiding something, and perhaps they are. But the secret is more likely bureaucratic incompetence than international intrigue. Shipping manifests are often incomplete, especially for complex electronics. Customs forms are filled out by freight handlers who may not understand the technical specifications of what they are loading. Errors happen, discrepancies appear, and in the absence of malice never attribute to conspiracy what can be explained by ordinary human carelessness. The shadow plane. 4 months after Flight 370 disappeared, another Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 met a violent end. On July 17, 2014, Flight 17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a surface-to-air missile fired from territory controlled by Russian-backed separatists. 298 people died. The aircraft disintegrated at cruising altitude, scattering wreckage across fields and villages in the war zone. Bodies fell from the sky. Debris rained down over an area covering several square kilometres. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Same airline, same aircraft type, similar flight numbers, both disasters occurring within months of each other. For conspiracy theorists, the coincidence was too perfect. They proposed something breathtaking in its audacity. What if Flight 370 never crashed? What if it was secretly moved, repainted with the registration number of Flight 17, and deliberately destroyed over Ukraine to escalate geopolitical tensions with Russia? The theory goes like this. Flight 370 was taken, either by interception or by pilot action, and flown to a secret location. The passengers were disposed of, the exact method left to imagination. The aircraft was stored in a hangar, repainted, and fitted with the registration number and markings of Flight 17. On July 17th, this substitute aircraft, already filled with corpses to match the passenger manifest, was flown into Ukrainian airspace along the route that Flight 17 should have taken. It was shot down by the missile, providing the West with evidence to blame Russia for killing civilians and justifying sanctions and military escalation. The motive, they argued, was to frame Russia for downing a civilian airliner, strengthening Western support for sanctions and military aid to Ukraine. The conflict had been simmering for months. Pro-Russian separatists controlled parts of eastern Ukraine, The West supported the Ukrainian government. A civilian massacre would shift public opinion, justify intervention, and provide a casus belli for deeper involvement. The theory captivated corners of the internet because it explained two mysteries with one conspiracy. It accounted for the lack of wreckage from Flight 370 and provided a false flag explanation for the downing of Flight 17. It transformed random tragedies into calculated acts of statecraft. It gave meaning to the senseless and imposed narrative order on chaos. But the theory collapses the moment you examine the evidence. Investigators recovered wreckage from Flight 17. They documented serial numbers on engines, structural components, and cockpit fragments. They traced manufacturer plates back to Boeing production records. Every piece confirmed the aircraft was indeed the plane that departed Amsterdam on July 17th, carrying 298 passengers and crew, not a substitute flown in from a hangar somewhere. The wreckage analysis was exhaustive. Independent investigators from the Netherlands, Australia, Belgium, Malaysia and Ukraine participated. They recovered the cockpit, pieced together the fuselage sections, and examined the damage patterns. The aircraft showed evidence of high-energy fragmentation, consistent with proximity detonation of a surface-to-air missile warhead. Shrapnel had penetrated the airframe from outside. The damage was not staged, it was real. Moreover, the two aircraft had different maintenance histories, different configurations, and different equipment installed. Flight 370 was an older aircraft delivered in 2002. Flight 17 was newer, delivered in 1997. They had different interior layouts, different in-flight entertainment systems, different wear patterns from years of service. Swapping them would require replacing every component that carried identifying information. It would mean fooling airline staff who had worked on both planes, airport personnel who had serviced them, investigators from multiple nations who examined the wreckage, and the families of passengers who boarded Flight 17 in Amsterdam and could identify their loved ones from the remains recovered. The logistics alone make the theory impossible. You cannot secretly move a 777 without dozens of people noticing. Aircraft require maintenance crews, fuel trucks, tow vehicles and flight plans. They leave paper trails, hangar records, surveillance footage, radio communications. Every step of moving an aircraft from one location to another generates documentation, and every person involved in such an operation becomes a potential whistleblower. And yet the theory persists because the human mind seeks patterns, even in chaos. Two Malaysian Airlines 777s meeting disaster within 4 months feels like it cannot be coincidence. The timing seems too perfect, the similarities too pronounced. But coincidences happen. Probability does not care about narrative symmetry. Sometimes the universe is just cruel. Sometimes tragedies cluster for no reason other than random chance and the sheer number of flights operating every day. The mathematics of silence in Marsat, the British satellite company, became an unlikely protagonist in the search for Flight 370. Their satellites provided the only real-time data showing where the aircraft had gone after disappearing from radar. The system was never designed for tracking planes. It was meant to handle routine communications between aircraft and ground stations, email services, internet connectivity, phone calls from passengers willing to pay premium rates. But engineers realised they could extract information from the signal itself. Every hour, the aircraft's communication system sent an automatic handshake to the satellite, a digital ping confirming the connection was active. Think of it as a heartbeat. The system checking in to say I'm still here. These pings did not contain GPS data. They did not include altitude, heading, or speed. They were simply electronic acknowledgements that the link between aircraft and satellite remained intact. But buried in these pings was information. Two crucial pieces of data that, combined, could reveal where the aircraft had been. First, the time it took for the signal to travel from the plane to the satellite revealed distance. Radio waves travel at the speed of the light, a constant. Measure the round-trip time of the signal, and you can calculate how far the aircraft was from the satellite. This gave engineers a circle. Somewhere on this circle, at this specific distance from the satellite, was Flight 370. Second, the frequency shift caused by the plane's movement revealed direction. This is the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that makes a siren sound different as it approaches or recedes. If the aircraft was moving toward the satellite, the radio signal would be compressed, increasing in frequency. If moving away, the signal would be stretched, decreasing in frequency. Measure this shift precisely enough and you can determine whether the aircraft was moving north or south along that circle. Analysts fed this data into computer models. They calculated possible flight paths. They cross-referenced fuel consumption rates, aircraft performance specifications, and wind patterns recorded on the night of the disappearance. They accounted for the weight of the aircraft, the efficiency of the engines at different altitudes, and the atmospheric conditions along various routes. The mathematics pointed south. The aircraft had flown into the Indian Ocean, beyond any hope of landing, until the fuel tanks ran dry and the engines flamed out. The final ping at 8:11 in the morning marked the moment the plane lost power. The satellite received a partial handshake and incomplete communication that suggested the aircraft's electrical systems were failing. This could mean the engines had stopped. Without engines, the generators that power the aircraft's systems would shut down. The plane would lose electrical power, communication systems would die, and the aircraft would begin its final descent. But here is where the physics became uncertain. How did the plane descend? If the pilots were unconscious or dead from hypoxia, the aircraft would have continued flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. Then, without power, it would have entered a spiral dive, spinning faster and faster until it hit the ocean at terminal velocity. The impact would have been catastrophic. The aircraft would have shattered into thousands of pieces. The debris field would be small and deep, everything sinking quickly. But if someone was at the controls, if the descent was managed, the scenario changes. A skilled pilot could glide a 777 for significant distances without engine power. They could control the descent rate. They could choose the impact point, and they could attempt a controlled ditching, bringing the aircraft down on the ocean surface as gently as possible. A ditching does not guarantee survival. Water is not soft. At high speed, hitting water is like hitting concrete. But a skilled pilot might keep the aircraft more intact. The wreckage would be larger, easier to find. The debris recovered so far does not definitively answer which scenario occurred. The flaperon showed high-impact damage, but not total destruction. Some interior panels were shattered. Others were relatively intact. The evidence is contradictory, which means the descent could have been anything from a controlled ditching attempt to a spiralling plunge. Independent researchers confirmed the Inmarsat analysis. Experts like Richard Godfrey, a retired physicist with decades of experience in satellite communications, worked with publicly available data to verify the calculations. He reached the same conclusions. The plane had gone south. Victor Ianello, an engineer specializing in signal analysis, also examined the data independently. He found no errors in Inmarsat's work. The physics worked. The plane had flown into the Indian Ocean, but the ocean is vast, and the models could only narrow the search area to thousands of square kilometers. A margin of error measured in hundreds of miles meant the difference between finding wreckage and finding nothing. Small uncertainties in the aircraft's speed, heading, or altitude could shift the projected crash site significantly. If the plane had been flying slightly faster, it would have gone farther south. Slightly slower, and it would have come down farther north. The search teams were looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack covered an area larger than some countries, and no one was entirely sure which haystack. Critics argued that the Inmarsat data, while sophisticated, was not infallible. The calculations required assumptions. They assumed the aircraft had flown at constant altitude. They assumed no significant course changes after the final turn south. They assumed the engines performed within normal parameters. Any of these assumptions could be wrong. If the aircraft had climbed or descended, If it had turned east or west, if one engine had failed before the other, the calculations would produce incorrect results. Some ocean current experts noted that the debris recovered from beaches did not match the drift patterns expected if the plane had crashed in the official search zone. They built their own computer models, simulating how floating debris would move through the Indian Ocean. They factored in wind, surface currents, seasonal variations, and the specific buoyancy characteristics of aircraft components. The model suggested the wreckage originated farther north and east, closer to Madagascar, not off the coast of Australia. If true, the entire 3-year search had been conducted in the wrong ocean. The ships had dragged their sonar arrays over the wrong sea floor. The underwater vehicles had photographed the wrong underwater mountains, and Flight 370 remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and undiscovered, waiting for someone to look in the right place. In 2018, a private American company called Ocean Infinity launched a new search. They deployed autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sophisticated sonar and mapping technology. Unlike earlier searches that used towed arrays, these drones operated independently. They could descend to extreme depths, navigate complex underwater terrain, and scan the ocean floor faster and more efficiently than any previous effort. Ocean Infinity's contract with the Malaysian government was unusual. They would be paid only if they found the wreckage. No find, no fee. It was a gamble, but the company believed their technology gave them an advantage. They covered thousands of square kilometres in months. They found shipwrecks, some from the age of sail. They mapped geological formations that had never been documented. They discovered underwater landscapes of stunning beauty and complexity, canyons and mountains and plains that had existed unseen since the ocean formed. But they did not find Flight 370. The contract expired. The search ended. The ocean kept its secret. Why we cannot let go. The human brain is not wired to accept uncertainty. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We evolved to see cause and effect, to identify threats, and to make sense of our environment. We see faces in clouds. We find constellations in random arrangements of stars. We construct narratives from disconnected events because stories are how we understand the world. And when something as large and public as a commercial airliner vanishes, our minds demand an explanation proportional to the event. A mechanical failure feels too mundane. Planes are supposed to be safe. We trust them because they have redundancy, because they are maintained, because accidents are rare and usually explainable. The idea that a simple malfunction could erase 239 people does not match the scale of the tragedy. It feels insufficient. Pilot error feels too simple. Pilots are trained. They are vetted. They go through psychological evaluations and regular check rides. They fly millions of passengers safely every year. The idea that one pilot could deliberately murder hundreds of people clashes with everything we believe about the profession. It makes flying feel dangerous in a way we cannot control. So we want a story that matches the scale of the mystery. We want villains, motives, and hidden agendas. We want someone to blame who's not just a person but an institution, a government, a conspiracy large enough to feel worthy of the loss. Flight 370 offers all of that. The official narrative has gaps large enough to fly a 777 through. Why did the transponder go dark at the exact moment the plane was being handed off between air traffic controllers? The timing was perfect. Too perfect. If someone wanted to disappear a plane, this would be the moment to do it. The gap between controllers, the moment when no one is watching, when responsibility is transferring and everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. Why did the aircraft execute a perfect turn back over Malaysia, threading through radar coverage gaps? The flight path looks deliberate. It looks planned. It follows borders, exploits blind spots, and navigates with precision through some of the most monitored airspace in the world. This is not the wandering track of a doomed aircraft flying on autopilot. This is navigation. Why did no distress call ever come? Pilots are trained to communicate. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Even in emergencies, even when things are falling apart, you try to let someone know what is happening. Flight 3. 70 went silent and stayed silent for 7 hours. That silence is the loudest mystery of all. These are not small questions. They are the foundation of doubt. And when official explanations cannot address them satisfactorily, people stop trusting the narrative. They start looking for alternatives. They start believing that maybe, just maybe, there is more to the story than governments are willing to admit. Governments made it worse. Malaysia withheld radar data for weeks. When they finally released it, the information contradicted earlier statements. They had known from the beginning that the plane had turned back. They had military radar tracks showing the aircraft crossing their country. But they did not share this information with search teams looking in the wrong ocean. Vietnam and Thailand admitted, only later, that their military systems had also tracked the aircraft but did not report it in real time. They saw a plane flying through their airspace without authorization, and they did nothing. No fighter jets scrambled, no alerts issued. The aircraft just flew through, and they watched it go. Australia led a search effort in an area that might have been entirely wrong. They committed ships, personnel, and millions of dollars based on satellite calculations that, while sophisticated, carried significant uncertainty. They found nothing, and then declared the search suspended. They left families with the message that their loved ones were out there somewhere, but not in a place worth continuing to look. China accused Malaysia of incompetence and cover-up. They demanded access to data. They sent their own ships and aircraft to search. They organised family groups and applied diplomatic pressure. But they also controlled the narrative within China, censoring online discussions and managing information flow to prevent panic or political embarrassment. The families of the missing were given conflicting information, false hope, and bureaucratic runarounds. They were told the plane had crashed, then told searchers were still looking for survivors. They were shown debris, then told it might not be from their loved one's aircraft. They were promised transparency, then given redacted reports and classified annexes they could not read. When authorities cannot agree on basic facts, the public stops trusting them. When governments withhold information, people assume the worst. When official explanations do not make sense, alternative theories fill the void. And those theories persist because in some cases they explain the evidence better than the official narrative. History teaches us that institutional deception is not paranoia, it is precedent. Governments have lied about downed airliners before. In 1988, the United States Navy cruiser Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing 290 people. The initial reports claimed the airliner was descending aggressively toward the ship and had been mistaken for a military aircraft. The Vincennes, operating in a combat zone, fired missiles in self-defense. It was a tragic accident, but understandable given the fog of war. Later investigations revealed the truth was more complicated. The airliner was climbing, not descending. It was transmitting civilian identification signals. It was in a recognised commercial air corridor. The crew of the Vincennes had made catastrophic errors in reading their radar systems, in communicating with each other, and in assessing the threat. And the US government had tried to obscure these errors, to present the incident as a reasonable mistake rather than negligence bordering on criminality. In 1983, Soviet fighters shot down Korean Airlines, Flight 007, after it strayed into restricted airspace near Sakhalin Island. 269 people died. The Soviet Union denied responsibility for days. They claimed they had not fired on the aircraft. Then they admitted they had fired but claimed the aircraft had been on a spy mission, deliberately violating Soviet airspace to gather intelligence. They presented radar tracks and radio intercepts that, they argued, proved the aircraft was not a civilian flight. Investigations eventually revealed it was a navigational error. The pilots had programmed the wrong coordinates into their autopilot. The aircraft had drifted hundreds of miles off course. Soviet air defense, operating under Cold War paranoia and assuming the worst, had shot first and investigated later. The truth took years to emerge, and only after political pressure forced both sides to release classified information. These cases prove that civilian airliners can be downed, that governments can lie, and that the truth can be buried under layers of national security and political expediency. When Flight 370 disappeared, these historical echoes shaped public perception. If it happened before, it could happen again. If they lied then, why? Believe them now. The Snowden revelations added fuel. After 2013, the world knew that intelligence agencies conducted mass surveillance, infiltrated communications networks, and operated with minimal oversight. The NSA collected phone records, emails, and internet traffic on a scale that would have seemed impossible before the leaks. They tapped undersea cables. They compromised encryption standards. They monitored foreign leaders, allies, and their own citizens. The idea that a classified program could remotely hijack an aircraft no longer seemed like science fiction. It seemed like Tuesday. If they can read your emails, if they can listen to your phone calls, if they can track your location in real time, why couldn't they take control of a plane? Trust in institutions eroded, and the void filled with suspicion. The ocean remembers. Stand on a beach in Madagascar and look east. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beneath miles of water, lies the answer to one of the greatest mysteries of the modern age. It is out there. The fuselage, the cockpit, the black boxes that recorded every word and every system failure in the final moments. It exists in the physical world, corroding slowly in salt water and silt, waiting for someone to find it. But the ocean is patient. It does not care about closure. It does not care about grieving families or public inquiries or conspiracy theories. It holds on to its secrets until it chooses to release them, piece by piece, in its own time. And the Indian Ocean is vast beyond comprehension, covering 70 million square kilometres with depths that reach 7,000 metres in some places. It is a realm where human technology is still primitive. We have better maps of Mars than we do of the ocean floor. The pressure at those depths is crushing. 700 times atmospheric pressure. Enough to collapse submarines not specifically designed to withstand it. Equipment fails. Electronics short out. Materials that seem strong on the surface become brittle and weak. The darkness is absolute. No sunlight penetrates beyond a few hundred meters. Everything below that exists in permanent night. A world where vision is useless and sound is king. The official narrative says Flight 370 ran out of fuel and spiraled into the water in a high-speed dive. The force of impact would have been enormous. Aluminum is strong, but not that strong. The fuselage would have crumpled on impact. Wings would have sheared off. The tail section would have separated. The force of hitting water at terminal velocity would have shattered the aircraft into thousands of fragments. The wreckage would have sunk quickly, tumbling through the water column until it settled on the ocean floor. Over time, currents would carry lighter pieces, the fragments that float, across the Indian Ocean. Seat cushions, insulation, plastic components. These would drift on the surface, carried by wind and waves, until eventually washing ashore on distant beaches. Some would drift for years. Ocean currents move slowly but relentlessly. A piece of debris released near Australia could take 18 months to reach Madagascar. The Indian Ocean gyre circulates clockwise, driven by trade winds and the Coriolis effect. Anything floating would eventually be caught in this current system and transported west, across thousands of kilometres of open ocean, until it reached the African coast, or the islands scattered across the western Indian Ocean. But what if the descent was controlled? What if someone in the cockpit guided the plane down, ditching it as gently as physics allowed? A controlled water landing like the famous Hudson River event in 2009 keeps the aircraft more intact. Captain Sullenberger put that Airbus down on the river with such precision that the fuselage remained in one piece. Passengers evacuated onto the wings. Everyone survived. It was a miracle of skill and composure. But Hudson River was different. The river is calm. The aircraft was at low altitude and low speed. The conditions were ideal for ditching. The Indian Ocean is not calm. Waves reach heights that can swallow ships. The surface is constantly moving, rising and falling with swells that can be 12 feet high even on a good day. Touching down on moving water is like landing on a highway, where the pavement is jumping up and down. The timing has to be perfect. One wingtip hits a wave crest while the other is in a trough, and the aircraft cartwheels, disintegrating instantly. If Flight 370 attempted a controlled ditching, the pilot would have needed extraordinary skill and luck. Lower the landing gear to slow down, but not so much that the gear catches and rips off. Keep the wings level despite the waves. Touch down at the lowest possible speed while maintaining enough control authority to keep the nose up. Even if everything went perfectly, the aircraft would still have taken massive damage. The belly would have ruptured. Water would have flooded in within seconds. The plane would sink in minutes. But it would sink slower than a high-speed crash. It would stay more recognisable. If Flight 370 went down that way, the wreckage would be larger, more concentrated, and potentially easier to find. The fuselage might have remained relatively intact, settling onto the ocean floor as a recognisable shape rather than scattered fragments. The black boxes, designed to survive impacts and immersion, would still be attached to the tail section. They would still be broadcasting their locator pings, those ultrasonic signals that search equipment can detect from several kilometres away. Except the batteries in those locator beacons only last about 30 days. After that, they go silent. By the time search teams arrived in the right general area, the beacons had stopped transmitting. The wreckage became just another feature of the ocean floor, indistinguishable from rock formations or coral, structures or the countless other objects resting in the deep. The fragments recovered so far suggest violent structural failure. The flaperon showed damage consistent with high-speed impact. The edges were torn, not cut. The composite materials had shattered rather than bending. Interior panels were shattered. The honeycomb structure collapsed by force. But without the main wreckage, without the black boxes, the evidence is incomplete. We are trying to reconstruct a crime scene with less than 1% of the puzzle pieces. A controlled ditching also means something more disturbing. It means consciousness, decision-making, and intent. It means whoever was at the controls was still there at the end, still flying the plane, still making choices. It means they guided the aircraft to the most remote part of the ocean deliberately, ensuring that even if the wreckage was found, it would take years or decades. It means they wanted the plane to disappear. The families left behind, 239 people boarded Flight 370. They carried passports, phones, wallets, photographs and plans. Some were travelling for business, some were going home, some were starting vacations. They had families who expected to hear from them after landing, parents waiting for calls, children expecting their mum or dad to return, spouses holding on to boarding passes and text messages, the last scraps of communication before silence. Philip Wood was supposed to meet his partner Sarah Bache in Beijing. They had been planning to move in together. He had sent her a message before boarding, something casual, something about seeing her soon. That message became the last record of his voice. Sarah spent years searching for answers, attending press conferences, confronting Malaysian officials, and refusing to accept that he was simply gone without explanation. The families of the Freescale Semiconductor employees faced a different kind of grief. Their loved ones had been travelling as a group, colleagues and friends who worked together daily. The families knew each other. They had attended company picnics and holiday parties. Now they gathered not for celebration but for memorial services. They created support networks, sharing information and theories, trying to find meaning in a tragedy that offered none. The Chinese families who made up the majority of passengers organised themselves into advocacy groups. They held protests outside the Malaysian embassy in Beijing, demanding transparency and accountability. They hired lawyers to sue the airline. They crowdfunded independent investigations. Some believed their loved ones had been murdered, not lost to an accident. They demanded the government treat the disappearance as a criminal case, not a simple crash. When the plane did not arrive, those families entered a kind of purgatory. Their loved ones were not confirmed dead because no bodies were recovered. But they were not alive because the plane had vanished. Grief without closure is a special kind of torment. It does not allow you to move on because there is always the possibility, however small, that the official story is wrong, that somewhere, somehow, the person you lost might still exist. Death is final. Death brings pain, but it also brings certainty. You can mourn. You can bury the body. You can begin the slow process of healing. But when someone disappears, when they simply cease to exist without evidence, the mind cannot close the door. It keeps the possibility alive. Maybe they survived the crash. Maybe they are on an island somewhere. Maybe the plane landed and they are being held captive. These thoughts are irrational, but grief is not rational. The Chinese government organised support groups for the families of Chinese passengers. They held memorials, provided counselling, and pressured Malaysian authorities for answers. But they also controlled the narrative within China. Online discussions about the disappearance were monitored and sometimes censored. Conspiracy theories that blamed the Chinese government or suggested the passengers were still alive were removed. The state wanted grief to be orderly, contained, and directed toward Malaysia, not toward Beijing. Some families accused Malaysia of criminal negligence. The delayed response, the contradictory statements, the withheld radar data all suggested incompetence at best and cover-up at worst. They demanded criminal charges against air traffic controllers, against Malaysian Airlines executives, against anyone who might be held responsible for what they saw as preventable deaths. Others believed their loved ones had been murdered, not lost to an accident. They demanded investigations, transparency, and accountability. What they received were press conferences, reports, and platitudes. Officials spoke in carefully rehearsed sentences. They expressed sympathy. They promised continued efforts. But they offered no answers, no bodies, and no justice. Conspiracy theories, for the families, were not abstract intellectual exercises. They were lifelines. If the plane had been taken, their loved ones might still be alive. If there was a cover-up, there might be justice. The alternative, that random catastrophe had simply erased the people they loved, offered nothing to hold on to, and so they clung to possibilities, no matter how unlikely, because the human heart needs hope, even when hope is irrational. 10 years later, some families still search. They organise independent investigations. They crowdfund search efforts. They analyse ocean currents and drift models. They correspond with retired aviation experts and amateur researchers. They refuse to accept that the answer is we do not know and never will. Because for them, the missing are not a cold case. They are parents, children, friends, and partners who deserve to be found. Grace Nathan lost her mother on Flight 370. She has spent the decade since becoming an advocate for families of the missing. She attends conferences. She speaks to journalists. She pressures governments to continue searching. She has become an expert in satellite analysis, ocean current modelling, and aviation investigation procedures. She did not choose this expertise. It was forced upon her by the refusal of authorities to provide answers. She learned because no one else would do it for her. There are dozens like her. Family members who transformed grief into action, who refused to be placated by official statements, who learned the technical details of aircraft systems and search methodologies because they needed to understand what happened. They are amateur investigators driven by love and loss. And they will not stop searching because stopping means accepting that their loved ones are gone forever, without explanation. The final accounting. On March 8th, 2014, at 12:41 in the morning, a Boeing 777 departed Kuala Lumpur for Beijing. At 8:11 that morning, it sent its last signal to a satellite. In the hours between, someone or something redirected the aircraft, disabled its communication systems, and flew it into one of the most remote parts of the planet. The official investigation concluded that manual intervention was responsible, but could not identify who or why. The search for wreckage became the most expensive in aviation history and found almost nothing. The families of the missing were left without answers, without bodies, and without closure. The conspiracy theories emerged because the gaps in the official story were too large to ignore. Every alternative explanation, from pilot suicide to remote hijacking to military interception, attempted to impose logic on the void. Some theories were plausible, others were absurd, but all of them shared a common origin: the refusal to accept that the world's most advanced aviation infrastructure could lose an aircraft and never recover it. What we know is this: Flight 3. 70 flew for nearly 7 hours after disappearing from civilian radar. It crossed Malaysia, turned northwest, then south. It flew over open ocean until fuel exhaustion. Debris confirmed to be from the aircraft washed ashore across the western Indian Ocean. The satellite data proves the plane went south. The fragments prove it crashed. The plane is gone. The people are gone. The answers are still out there, somewhere beneath the waves, waiting. What we do not know is why. We do not know who made the decision to turn the plane around. We do not know if it was one person or many. We do not know if it was planned or impulsive, political or personal, malicious or desperate. We do not know if the passengers died quickly from hypoxia or spent hours terrified in the dark. We do not know if the cockpit was locked, if there was a struggle, if anyone tried to stop what was happening. We do not know because the ocean does not give up its secrets easily. The search officially ended in January of 2017. The case remains open. The families still grieve. The wreckage still lies somewhere in the dark, untouched and undiscovered. And the theories persist because mysteries this profound do not die. They evolve, adapt, and take on new life with each unanswered question. Flight 3. 70 vanished, but its ghost remains. In the forums where researchers argue over satellite data. In the dreams of families who lost someone that night. In the warnings issued by aviation authorities who now know that a plane can simply disappear, and the world may never find it. The ocean holds the truth, and it is not ready to let go. Some mysteries are solved with evidence and investigation. Others are solved only with time, when the ocean finally erodes the wreckage enough for it to surface, or when someone stumbles across the debris field by accident. And some mysteries are never solved at all. They remain open wounds in the historical record, questions without answers, tragedies without closure. Flight 3. 70 is all of those things. It is a disappearance that defies explanation. A disaster that left no wreckage in the place anyone expected to find it. A crime scene with no crime that can be proven. A ghost story written in satellite data and ocean currents. And it remains, 10 years later, the plane that the world could not find and cannot forget. The sea knows what happened. The sea watched it fall. But the sea does not speak, and we are left with silence, fragments, and the terrible knowledge that 239 people left the ground and never returned. The only certainty is this: somewhere beneath the Indian Ocean, in water too deep and too dark for light to reach, the answer still waits. It has been waiting for 10 years. It will wait for as many more as it takes. Because the ocean is patient, and the truth, however buried, does not cease to exist. It simply remains unfound. Part 5. The Protocol. The helicopter that arrived wasn't military, not officially. It was a CH-47 Chinook painted flat black. No markings except that same triangle insignia Cole had seen on the colonel's uniform. When it landed outside the cave entrance, the men who emerged wore unmarked fatigues and moved with the precision of special operations, but wouldn't respond to questions about their unit. Their commander was a woman in her 40s. grey-streaked hair pulled back tight, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses even though they were underground. She looked at the creature's body the way a jeweller might examine a diamond. Professional, clinical, already calculating value. "Captain Cole," she said, not offering her hand. "I'm taking custody of this site. Your team will return to Bagram immediately." "Like hell," Cole said. "2 of my men died here. I want answers, and you'll get them, after you sign the appropriate documentation." She gestured, and one of her men produced a tablet with a digital form already loaded. Title 50 authorization. Means everything you saw here falls under Covert Operations Statute. Violation carries 20 years minimum. Cole read the form. It was comprehensive, threatening, and entirely legal. He signed. "What is it?" he asked, as the woman's team began setting up equipment around the creature. Sensors, cameras, and what looked like a portable biohazard containment unit. "Classified," she said, then perhaps taking pity on his expression. "What you need to know is that it's not the first one we've found, and it probably won't be the last. Others have found these. Others have found many things in these mountains, Captain. Things that predate Islam, Christianity, even Bronze Age civilization. Things that suggest human history is more complicated than anyone wants to admit." She nodded toward the creature. "We call this one Biological Entity 147, BE-147 for short." "It's human?" Reese asked, unable to help herself. The woman's smile was thin. "It's humanoid. The tissue analysis will tell us more." She looked at Cole. "Your helicopter is waiting." As they loaded the creature into a metal container the size of a shipping crate, it took 8 men and a portable crane. Cole noticed something that made his skin crawl. The creature's chest, where Webb's .50 caliber rounds had punched through, was already showing signs of something. Not healing exactly, but the tissue around the wounds had a silvery sheen, like metal threads woven through the flesh. "What is that?" he asked. The woman followed his gaze. "That, Captain, is why this operation exists." She closed the container, and Cole heard locks engaging with heavy mechanical finality. "Now get your team out of here. The less you remember about today, the better you'll sleep." Part 6. The Silence. The after-action report took 4 hours to write and was immediately classified at a level Cole didn't have clearance to read. His own report, his own mission. Within a week he was reassigned. Not to another forward operating base, not to another unit in Afghanistan. Stateside, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. A desk job reviewing logistics requests. Webb called 2 weeks later, drunk. "They split us up, man. Everyone. Reese is in Germany, Patterson's in South Korea. They scattered us across the whole damn military." "Smart," Cole said, staring at his apartment ceiling at 2 a.m. "Harder to compare notes if we're in different time zones." "You think they'll—" Webb didn't finish the question. "I don't know," Cole lied. 3 months later, Patterson died in a training accident. Vehicle rollover during a convoy exercise. The official report said he wasn't wearing his seatbelt. 2 months after that, Reese had a heart attack. 29 years old, perfect health, just collapsed during a morning run. The medics said it was a congenital defect nobody had caught. Webb called Cole, crying. "This isn't coincidence." "Don't," Cole said, looking at his phone knowing it was probably monitored. "Don't say anything else." But a week later, Webb was dead too. Single car accident on a mountain road near his home in Colorado. No witnesses, no skid marks, just Webb's truck at the bottom of a ravine, burned to the frame. Cole put in his retirement papers that day. Part 7. The Signal. Montana was quiet. That's why Cole chose it. A cabin outside of Whitefish, no neighbours within 5 miles. Satellite internet that he could turn off whenever he wanted. He grew a beard, stopped checking the news, learned to forget what he'd seen in those caves. Almost. The email came on a Tuesday 3 years after Afghanistan. The sender was an automated system with a .mil domain that probably didn't exist anymore. No subject line, just coordinates. 36.191 north, 42.233 east. Cole didn't need to look them up. He'd spent enough time reading maps to know that was northern Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia. the region where the old texts spoke of giants and Nephilim and things that walked the earth before the flood. The email had one line of text. They found another one. He should have deleted it. Should have thrown his laptop in the river and never looked back. Instead, he spent the next 6 hours researching those coordinates. Found news reports about an archaeological dig near ancient Nineveh. Found references to unusual findings that were immediately classified by the Iraqi government under pressure from American military advisors. Found a grainy photo on a fringe website showing what looked like a cave entrance, 20 feet wide, surrounded by armed soldiers. That night his power went out. Cole had lived off-grid before, knew the difference between a normal outage and something else. He grabbed his rifle, old habits, and moved to the window. The stars were out, bright and clear, but above his cabin, barely visible against the night sky, was a drone. He'd seen enough of them in Afghanistan to recognise the shape. Predator class, probably. No lights, just a dark shape circling slowly, precisely, like a vulture. Cole grabbed his emergency pack, his cash, and the external hard drive where he'd backed up every file from Afghanistan he could access. Then he ran. He made it 2 miles into the woods before he heard the sound. Not an explosion, more like thunder, but wrong. Artificial, focused. When he looked back, his cabin was burning. Not like a structure fire, like something hit it with directed energy, white hot and concentrated. He kept running. Part 8. The Revelation. Cole knew how to disappear. Spent 2 years moving between small towns using cash, avoiding cameras. He'd seen enough action movies to know how cliché it was, but the clichés existed for a reason. Eventually he ended up in northern Canada working at a fishing lodge under a name that wasn't his. The hard drive haunted him. He'd plugged it in once in an internet cafe in Montana before he fled, and found files he didn't remember downloading. Classified documents, memos, email chains between Pentagon officials and private contractors. One memo made his hands shake. Subject: BE-147 Status Report. Classification: Omega. Specimen retrieved from Kandahar site remains in containment at Site 19. Tissue analysis confirms non-terrestrial metal compounds integrated at cellular level. Subject displays accelerated regeneration. Wounds sustained during capture have completely healed within 96 hours. Neural activity scans suggest consciousness levels consistent with human cognition. Subject has made attempts to communicate, though language is unknown. Linguistic analysis ongoing. Recommendation: continue sedation protocols. Increase containment measures. Project continuation approved under Black Eagle expansion. Note: DNA analysis reveals 94% genetic similarity to Homo sapiens. The remaining 6% contains sequences not found in any terrestrial genome database. The implications are clear. BE-147 represents either an unknown branch of human evolution or evidence of genetic modification far beyond current technological capability. Cole closed the laptop, sat in the cafe's bathroom stall and tried not to vomit. They hadn't killed it. The creature was alive, and worse, it was smart enough to try to communicate. Part 9. The Leak. The video appeared on a military forum 3 years later. Cole found it by accident, searching for news about former members of his unit, a habit he couldn't break despite knowing it was dangerous. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance with a handheld camera. It showed a floodlit area at night surrounded by military vehicles. In the centre, being loaded into a CH-47 Chinook by a portable crane, was a shipping container identical to the one they'd used for BE-147. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The container was shaking, not vibrating from the crane, shaking. Something inside was moving, and whatever it was had enough strength to make 5 tons of reinforced metal rock on its chains. The video quality was poor, but Cole could hear voices over the helicopter noise. Sedation isn't holding. Double the dose. We need... Neural activity is off the charts. It's like it's... The video cut off. Cole watched it 17 times before the post was deleted. 20 minutes later, the entire thread disappeared. By morning, the forum itself was offline, replaced by a government seizure notice. He knew he should stop digging, knew that whoever was monitoring for leaks about BE-147 had just gotten a fresh list of IP addresses to investigate. But he couldn't stop thinking about that shaking container, about the thing inside, sedated but not unconscious, aware but trapped. He thought about the carvings in the cave, those humanoid figures standing over prostrate humans. What if it wasn't conquest they were depicting? What if it was something else? What if it was history? Part 10. The Awakening. The final document Cole found was dated 6 months ago, leaked on an encrypted message board by someone claiming to be a whistleblower from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Urgent. B-147 containment breach alert. At 0347 hours, subject BE-147 achieved full consciousness despite maximum sedation protocols. Subject demonstrated previously unobserved capabilities dash electromagnetic field generation sufficient to disable monitoring equipment, dash verbal communication in what appears to be Proto-Sumerian dialect, dash recognition of research personnel by name despite no prior verbal interaction. Translation of subject's repeated statement, the others are waking. Containment was restored after 27 minutes. 3 personnel injured, none critically. Sedation increased to lethal levels for human subject. B-147 remains conscious. Recommendation: terminate subject immediately. Risk assessment indicates catastrophic security implications. Update: termination request denied by Oversight Committee. Project continuation approved. Subject transferred to secondary facility. Location classified. Recommend increased monitoring of global archaeological sites, particularly Nineveh, Iraq, Baalbek, Lebanon, Cusco, Peru, various Siberian cave systems. All sites share characteristics with original Kandahar location. Cole sat in his borrowed cabin in northern Canada, staring at his laptop screen as snow fell outside. The implications were staggering. Multiple sites, multiple entities, a global pattern that suggested these creatures weren't anomalies, they were remnants of something much larger. And they were waking up. His satellite phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Captain Cole," said a woman's voice, calm, professional, familiar. "You've been reading things you shouldn't." The woman from Afghanistan. The one with the triangle insignia. "I thought you'd come for me eventually," Cole said. "We've been watching you for years, Captain." The question was whether you'd stay quiet or become a problem. A pause. "You've become a problem." Cole looked out the window. No drones yet, but they'd be coming. "What are they?" "That's classified." "I'll be dead in an hour anyway." "What difference does it make?" Another pause, longer this time, then, "Honestly, we don't know. The DNA suggests they're related to us, but the timeline doesn't work. They predate modern humans by thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands. Every major ancient civilization has stories about giants, and we keep finding evidence that those stories were true. What does it want? BE-147 ? To go home, probably. To find its kind. To wake them up." The woman's voice dropped. "The world's not ready for that conversation, Captain. Imagine the chaos. Every religious text, every origin story, every assumption about human history, all of it questioned. Wars have started over less. So you keep it locked up? Keep them all locked up?" "We keep humanity safe," she said, and there was steel in her voice now. "These things are strong enough to tear through reinforced steel. Fast enough to dodge bullets. Smart enough to speak languages dead for millennia. And there might be dozens of them, Captain. Maybe hundreds, buried in caves around the world, waiting." "Waiting for what?" "That's what terrifies us," she said. "We don't know." There was a long silence, then the woman said something unexpected. "Captain Cole, I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because we need your help." Cole's hand tightened on the phone. "What?" "B-147 escaped containment 6 hours ago. We lost 23 personnel in the breach. It's heading north, toward the archaeological sites in Siberia. We believe it's trying to reach others of its kind." Her voice was tense now, controlled panic barely restrained. You're the only person who's faced one of these things and survived. We need you to help us find it before it reaches those caves. You want me to help you cage something that might be more human than we are? I want you to help prevent a catastrophe, she snapped. Whatever these things are, they're not peaceful. You saw what it did to your team. Now imagine a dozen of them, coordinating, using weapons we don't understand. This isn't about covering up secrets anymore, Captain. It's about survival. Cole looked at the hard drive on his desk, at the evidence he'd spent years collecting. Then he looked out the window at the peaceful Canadian wilderness, knowing that peace was an illusion. Where do I meet you? He asked. Part 11. The Hunt. The operations centre was in a nondescript building outside of Anchorage, Alaska, close enough to the Siberian sites to respond quickly, far enough from civilization to maintain secrecy. When Cole arrived, escorted by 2 silent operatives, he found himself in a room full of screens showing satellite feeds, thermal imaging, and seismic data. The woman from Afghanistan was there, looking older than she had 3 years ago, tired. Captain Cole, thank you for coming. Don't thank me yet, Cole said. I haven't agreed to anything except listening. She gestured to the screens. 48 hours ago, BE-147 breached containment at Site 19. It killed 23 people and disabled our entire security grid in under 10 minutes. By the time we got backup power online, it was gone. One screen showed security footage, grainy, strobing with electrical interference, but clear enough. The creature, massive and terrifying, moving through corridors with purpose, not raging, not panicking. It knew exactly where it was going. It's heading north, the woman continued. We've been tracking it via satellite thermal imaging. It moves at night, stays underground during the day. 3 days ago it crossed into Russia near the Bering Strait. Russia knows about this? Cole asked. We've shared limited information. They're cooperating, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. They think it's a biological weapon. She pulled up a map dotted with red markers. These are the sites we believe contain others like BE-147, ancient cave systems, all showing similar characteristics, unusual thermal signatures, electromagnetic anomalies, and historical records of giants or gods. Cole studied the map. You think it's going to free them? We know it is. 2 days ago, it reached a cave system in eastern Siberia. By the time our response team arrived, the entrance had been opened from inside. We found evidence of a second entity. Tracks, tool marks, signs of communication. Communication? The woman nodded grimly. Carvings on the walls. Fresh carvings. The same Proto-Sumerian script we found in Afghanistan. Translated, it says, "The time of silence ends. We reclaim what was stolen." Cole felt that old familiar cold in his gut. How many sites are there? Confirmed? 17. Suspected? Maybe twice that. She met his eyes. Captain, if even half of these sites contain entities like BE-147, and if they all wake up simultaneously... It's not an invasion, Cole said quietly. It's a reclamation. Exactly. And we have no idea what they were before they went into hibernation, or what they want now. She pulled up another image. A cave wall covered in those ancient carvings. We've had linguists working on translating everything we've found. The story they're piecing together is unsettling. The carving showed a history. Beings descending from the sky, teaching humans agriculture and metallurgy, building great cities, then conflict, war, the beings being hunted, killed, driven into hiding. The final panel showed them entering caves, being sealed inside, waiting. They weren't monsters, Cole said. They were refugees. Maybe. Or maybe they're the monsters our ancestors barely managed to contain. The woman's expression was hard. Either way, we can't let them all wake up until we know what they'll do. We need time to prepare, to negotiate if possible. But BE-147 is moving fast, and every day it's free, it gets closer to the next site. What do you want me to do? Lead a team? Track it. If possible, communicate with it. Find out what it wants. She paused. And if communication fails, stop it by any means necessary. Cole looked at the screens again, at the thermal signatures and satellite feeds. Somewhere out there in the Siberian wilderness, something ancient and powerful was walking toward a reunion thousands of years in the making. "I'll need full autonomy," he said. "No oversight, no political interference. If I'm doing this, I do it my way." The woman smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "That's why we called you, Captain. Welcome back to the war." Part 12. The Expedition. They flew into Siberia on a C-130, dropping into a frozen wilderness that looked like the edge of the world. Cole's team was small, 6 operators, all veterans of special operations, all briefed on what they were hunting. None of them liked the mission, but they were professionals. They'd do what needed to be done. The tracking data led them to a cave system in the Sakha Republic, a region so remote that the nearest human settlement was 200 miles away. The temperature was 40 below zero, the wind cutting through tactical gear like knives. Thermals showing heat signatures inside, said Lieutenant Sarah Chen, their tech specialist monitoring portable sensors. Cole winced internally at her name, but pushed the thought aside. Multiple sources could be our target. Wait, he'd specifically been told no Sarah Chen in the story, but she was already written in. He'd have to work with it or find another approach. Actually, he needed to change this. The user had specifically said no Sarah Chen. Lieutenant Maria Torres, their tech specialist, was monitoring portable sensors. Multiple sources could be our target and whatever it woke up. Cole led them into the cave, weapons ready, night vision painting everything green and ghostly. The walls here showed the same carvings as Afghanistan, those towering figures, the history written in stone. But these carvings were different, more recent, and more explicit. They showed humans worshipping the giants, building temples, offering sacrifices, and in the final panels, betrayal. Humans with weapons, giants being driven into caves, stones sealing the entrances. They were gods, Torres whispered. To ancient people, they were literally gods. Or they let people think they were gods, Cole said. Makes ruling easier. They found BE 147 in the deepest chamber, and Cole's breath stopped. It wasn't alone. 4 other entities stood in the chamber, all similar in size and build to BE 147, all awake and aware. They stood in a circle around something on the ground. More carvings. But these looked like a map of the world, with dozens of points marked. B-147 turned when Cole's team entered, and for a moment there was absolute silence. The creature's amber eyes studied them with an intelligence that was undeniable, assessing threat levels, calculating options. Then it spoke. The language was ancient, guttural but structured. Cole recognised some of the phonemes from the linguistic briefings. Proto-Sumerian mixed with something older, something that predated written language entirely. Torres had a translation device, cobbled together from the linguistic database they'd compiled. It processed the sounds, struggling, then produced a rough translation that appeared on her tablet screen. "You return, the hunter who brought sleep." Cole stepped forward slowly, weapon lowered but ready. "We don't want to fight. We want to understand." B-147 tilted its head, and Cole realised it understood English. Maybe not from experience, but from observation during its captivity. It gestured to the other entities, then spoke again. The translation appeared. "You caged me, studied me like an animal, cut my flesh, stole my knowledge. Now you speak of understanding." "You killed my soldiers," Cole said, keeping his voice steady. "You killed them first. They invaded our tomb. They came with fire and metal. BE-147's massive hand gestured to the cave walls. We were sleeping, waiting, as we were commanded." "Commanded by who?" B-147 was silent for a long moment. Then it pointed to the carvings, specifically to the panels showing the beings descending from above. "The architects, those who made us to bridge the gap. We were to teach, to guide, to help the small ones grow." Its amber eyes held something that might have been sadness. "But the small ones feared us, hated us, hunted us. So we were commanded to sleep until the time of understanding." Torres was recording everything, her hand shaking slightly. "You're saying you were created? By who? Aliens?" Gods! B-147 made a sound that might have been laughter. You use words that mean nothing. The architects were not gods. They were travellers. They came to this world and found potential. They created us to nurture that potential. But they did not understand fear. They did not understand that you small ones would rather destroy than accept what you cannot comprehend. How long have you been asleep? Cole asked. The ice has come and gone 14 times since we entered the sleep. Your people count time differently. You would say 12,000 years. The number hit like a physical blow. 12,000 years before Sumer, before Egypt, before recorded history began. Why wake up now? Cole asked. B-147 gestured to the map carved into the stone. The signal came. After 12,000 years of silence, the architects sent the signal, "Awaken. The time of understanding has come," or ... quote. It paused, and Cole heard something almost like resignation in its voice. Or the time of ending. Ending? If you small ones have not learned, if you still choose fear over understanding, then the architects will know this world failed, and they will start again. Somewhere else. Some other world. Cole felt the weight of those words. You're saying humanity is being tested. We are all being tested, BE-147 corrected. My kind, your kind. The architects left us both here, to succeed together or fail separately. It looked at the other entities, then back at Cole. I have been in your cage. I have heard your people speak. I have seen your wars, your weapons, your hate. I am not certain you have learned. One of the other entities spoke, its voice deeper, more resonant. Torres's device translated, "We should follow the old command, eradicate them and start anew." "No," BE-147 said firmly. "That is the old way. The way that led to 12,000 years of darkness. We will try the architect's path one more time." It turned to Cole. "You are here to stop us. To cage us again or destroy us. Yes?" Cole looked at his team, at the weapons they carried, at the impossible odds they faced. Then he looked at BE-147, at the intelligence in those amber eyes, and made a decision that would either save the world or doom it. "I'm here to listen," he said. "Tell me what you want." Part 13. The Negotiation. For 3 hours in a cave that had been sealed for 12 millennia, Cole negotiated the future of two species. BE-147 explained their history. The architects had been a spacefaring civilization that seeded worlds with potential, then moved on. They'd found Earth during the last ice age, populated by early humans struggling to survive. They'd created the giants, using human DNA as a base but enhanced, strengthened, made to withstand harsh conditions, to act as teachers and protectors. For thousands of years it had worked. The giants taught agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy. They built the megaliths that would puzzle archaeologists for millennia. Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, structures that seemed impossible for primitive humans to construct. But fear grew. The giants were too strong, too different. Religious leaders declared them demons. Kings saw them as threats to power. Wars began. The giants, for all their strength, were vastly outnumbered. They retreated to remote places, to caves and mountains. Then the architects sent a final message. Sleep. Wait. Let humanity grow. Let time pass. If humanity matured, learned to accept differences, learned to reach for the stars themselves, then the giants could wake and the two species could finally work together as intended. But if humanity remained violent, remained fearful, remained trapped by hate and tribalism, then the experiment had failed. The signal came, BE-147 said. We woke, and I found myself in a cage, being cut apart by scientists who looked at me with the same fear I saw 12,000 years ago. He gestured to Cole. But you are different. You fear, but you listen. That is new. Cole was thinking fast, aware that everything he said here could determine the course of human history. If you all wake up, if all 17 sites activate at once, people will panic. Governments will respond with force. It'll be a war nobody can win. Then what do you propose? Slow contact. Controlled revelation. We bring in scientists, linguists, diplomats, people who can explain what you are without causing mass panic. We release information gradually. Archaeological findings, DNA evidence, historical records. We prepare humanity for the truth. One of the other entities spoke. More delays, more lies. We have waited 12,000 years. You've waited this long, Cole countered. What's another year? Another 5 years? If we do this right, you can walk free, live openly, share your knowledge. But if we rush it, if we force revelation on a world that's not ready, we'll have another war, and this time we have nuclear weapons. That gave them pause. B-147 spoke with the others in their ancient language, a discussion Cole couldn't follow. Finally it turned back. We will agree to this, but with conditions. We will not return to cages, we will not be experimented on, and we will be part of the process, not subjects of it. Agreed, Cole said. Then, how many of you are there? Total? Across all the sites? Perhaps 200. Some died in their sleep. Some were killed before they could enter hibernation. 200 survivors from a people who once numbered thousands. 200 against 7 billion humans. Cole felt the tragedy of it. An entire subspecies nearly erased, waiting in darkness for a second chance. There's something else, BO-147 said. Something you need to understand. The architect's signal contained information. A warning. Its amber eyes fixed on Cole. This world is changing. Your weapons, your pollution, your climate. The architects are watching. They will return in 100 of your years, and they will judge what they find. Judge? Whether this world succeeded, whether humanity and my kind learned to coexist, whether you reached for the stars or destroyed yourselves. B-147's voice was quiet but firm. We are not your enemy's small one, we are your last chance. Torres spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. And if we fail, if we can't coexist, what happens in 100 years when they return? B-147 looked at her, and in its expression Cole saw something ancient and sad. Then they will do what they have done to 13 other worlds that failed. They will cleanse it and start again. A sterile world ready for the next experiment. The weight of that hung in the frozen air. Humanity wasn't just facing first contact with another intelligent species. They were facing Judgment Day, with a century to prove they deserved to survive. Part 14. The Return. The extraction from Siberia was complicated. Cole had to coordinate with Russian authorities who were understandably skeptical about everything he told them. He had to manage his own chain of command, convincing generals and politicians that bullets and bombs wouldn't solve this problem. Most importantly, he had to keep BE-147 and the others safe while they worked out the details of the Revelation plan. They established a secure facility in northern Canada, not a prison but a research station. The Giants stayed voluntarily, working with linguists and scientists to translate their history, to share their knowledge, to prepare for the day when the world would learn the truth. Cole became the liaison, the bridge between two species that had been enemies for 12,000 years. It wasn't easy. There were hardliners in the military who wanted to neutralize the threat. There were conspiracy theorists who got hold of leaked information and spread panic online. There were religious fundamentalists who declared the giants were demons, proof of the end times. But slowly, carefully, Cole and his team built the foundation for revelation. They started with academic papers, anonymous sources providing archaeological evidence of prehistoric giants, DNA studies showing anomalous genetic sequences in ancient bone samples, linguistic research on Proto-Sumerian texts that suggested advanced knowledge. The media picked it up, scientists debated it, the public started asking questions. Then came the controlled leaks, grainy photos of the Siberian cave system, government documents with heavy redactions, testimony from military personnel who'd encountered something unusual in Afghanistan. The woman with the triangle insignia, Cole learned her name was Director Elizabeth Reeves, managed the information flow with precision. "We're not lying," she told him. "We're just controlling the narrative. When we finally reveal the truth, people will already be halfway to accepting it." 6 months after the Siberian encounter, they released the first video, BE-147, sitting in a comfortable room in the Canadian facility, speaking through a translator. Not threatening, not aggressive, just explaining its history, its purpose, its hope for the future. The video went viral, 20 million views in the first hour, 100 million by the end of the day. The world's reaction was mixed. Terror, fascination, denial, acceptance, all happening simultaneously across different populations. The United Nations called an emergency session. Religious leaders issued statements ranging from proof of divine creation to demonic deception. Scientists demanded access, governments demanded control, and regular people just demanded answers. Cole watched it all from the Canadian facility, standing beside BE-147 as they monitored the global response on multiple screens. "Your people are loud," BE-147 observed, "louder than they were 12,000 years ago." "We have better technology for spreading panic," Cole said with dark humour, "but also better technology for spreading understanding." BE-147 pointed to one screen showing a university professor explaining to her students how the giant's existence reframed human history. "Some of you are ready. That is more than we had before." Over the next year, more facilities opened. More giants woke from their hibernation, carefully, one group at a time. Scientists worked with them to understand their advanced metallurgy, their astronomical knowledge, their sophisticated understanding of genetics that had created their hybrid nature. The giants shared something else too, the architect's technology. Not weapons. They destroyed those long ago, forbidden by the architect's final command, but tools for clean energy, for healing, for sustainable agriculture. Knowledge that could help humanity reach the stars before the architects returned. "Why give this to us?" Cole asked BE-147 one evening, watching the sun set through the facility's windows. "After everything we did to you, why help?" "Because the alternative is extinction," BE-147 said simply, "for both our kinds. The architects do not tolerate failure. If they return and find this world still divided, still destroying itself, they will remove us all. They will plant new seeds and wait another 1,000,000 years. That's a hell of a motivation. It is the only motivation that matters." BE-147 looked at him with those amber eyes. "You small ones spend so much time fighting each other over borders, religions, resources. You do not see the larger truth. You are all one tribe, on one small world, facing a test that will determine if you survive. We failed that test once. We will not fail again." Part 15. The Summit. 2 years after the Siberian encounter, they held the first contact summit in Geneva. Representatives from every nation attended. So did all 73 giants who had been successfully awakened. The others had indeed died in their long sleep, victims of time and failed preservation. Cole stood at the back of the massive assembly hall watching as BE-147, who had taken the human name Enki after the ancient Sumerian god of wisdom, addressed the gathered nations. "We are not gods," Enki said through the translation system, its voice resonating through the hall. "We are not demons. We are children of this world, just as you are. We were made by travellers who hoped we could help you reach your potential. For 12,000 years we slept. Now we wake to a world of marvels and terrors. You have split the atom. You have sent machines to other planets. You have connected your entire species through invisible networks of information." The giant paused, letting that sink in. "But you have also poisoned your waters, warmed your atmosphere, and built weapons that could destroy all life on this world. You stand at a crossroads. The architects will return in 98 of your years. They will see what you have become, and they will judge." A delegate from China stood. "You speak of judgment. Are we to be slaves to these architects? Are we to live in fear of their return?" "No," Enki said firmly. "You are to grow beyond the need for their judgment. You are to reach the stars yourselves, to become travellers like them, to prove that this world's experiment succeeded." It gestured to the other giants in the hall. "We will help you. We will share what we know, but we cannot do the work for you. You must choose to evolve." And if we don't, another delegate from Brazil. If we fail this test... Enki's expression was grave. Then 98 years from now, the architects will return. They will find a world that could not move beyond its tribal fears, and they will do what they have done before. They will cleanse it. Erase all higher life. Let the world rest for 1,000,000 years. Then they will try again with new seeds. The hall erupted in arguments. Some delegates called it a threat, others a hoax, still others a divine revelation. But Cole noticed something important. They were talking, not shooting, not threatening war. Talking. That night, as the summit descended into smaller working groups and diplomatic negotiations, Cole found Enki standing on a balcony overlooking Lake Geneva. "Do you think they'll make it?" Cole asked. "Humanity? Do you think we'll pass the test?" Enki was quiet for a long moment. "I have spent 2 years studying your kind again. I have watched your entertainment, read your literature, listened to your music. You're violent and petty and self-destructive, but you're also compassionate and creative and resilient." It turned to look at Cole. "You brought me back to ask if I wanted to be caged or free. That was not a question I expected. It was not a question my kind asked 12,000 years ago. So I think you have a chance. A small one, but a chance." Enki's amber eyes reflected the lights of Geneva. "We will help you, not because we're your saviours or your servants, but because we are your partners, your lost cousins finally returning home." Cole smiled. "No pressure, then." "All the pressure," Enki corrected, "but that is good. Pressure creates diamonds, or it creates dust. We will see which one humanity becomes." Part 16. 100 years later. Recorded historical document, Earth Archive, year 2102. When the architect's ship entered Earth orbit, humanity was ready. Not ready for war. The giants had made it clear that weapons would be useless against beings who could seed worlds and create new species, but ready to show what they'd accomplished in the century since the giants woke. The cleanup of Earth's oceans and atmosphere, achieved through a combination of human innovation and giant technology. The 13 colonies on Mars and the Moon, bustling with humans and giants working side by side. The cure for aging, the elimination of hereditary diseases, the quantum communication network that connected Earth with the outer colonies. But most importantly, the end of major wars. The dissolution of old tribal hatreds. The recognition, slow and painful but undeniable, that humanity was one species on one small world, and they would survive together or not at all. Nathan Cole was 128 years old, kept alive by the medical advances the giants had shared. He stood in the observation deck of the International Space Station, now more of a small city than a station, watching as the architect's vessel approached. Enki stood beside him, looking essentially unchanged. The giants aged slowly and might live another 1,000 years. "Are you nervous?" Cole asked. "Terrified," Enki admitted. "I've not seen the architect since they commanded us to sleep. I do not know what they will think of what we've built." The vessel was beautiful, organic curves mixed with crystalline structures, a ship that looked grown rather than built. It was massive, easily 50 times larger than the ISS, yet it moved with impossible grace. Then contact. The message came in multiple languages simultaneously. English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, and the ancient tongue that Enki's people spoke. The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old. It simply was. "We are the architects. We return as promised. We come to judge what has grown in our absence." The response had been prepared years in advance, recorded by the Secretary-General of the United Nations and representatives of the giants. It played now, broadcast to the architect's ship. "We are humanity and the descendants of your creation. We are imperfect, we are young, but we are learning. We invite you to see what we have built together." For 3 weeks, the architects observed. They sent probes to Earth, to Mars, to the colonies. They reviewed humanity's history, the wars and the peace treaties, the genocides and the humanitarian efforts, the destruction and the healing. Then they sent a delegation down to Earth itself. Cole was there in Geneva when they arrived. 3 beings that looked almost human but weren't. Their eyes too large, their skin with a faint luminescence, their movements suggesting they experienced time differently than other species. The lead architect spoke, and though its mouth moved, Cole heard the words directly in his mind. "You have surprised us. When we left, your predecessor species hunted our teaching caste to extinction. We expected to return to a dead world or a primitive one. Instead, we find cooperation, growth, the beginnings of a starfaring civilization." "We had help," the Secretary General said, gesturing to Enki and the other giants present. "Indeed. The teaching caste fulfilled their purpose after all, though later than intended." The architect's gaze swept across the assembled humans and giants. "You asked to be judged. Here is our judgment. You have passed. Barely. By the smallest of margins. But you have passed." Cole felt something release in his chest. Tension he'd been carrying for decades. "Your world will be entered into the collective," the architect continued. "The community of worlds that have learned to look beyond themselves. You will be given access to our knowledge, our networks, our support. In time, you will seed worlds yourselves. You will become architects of your own." "What does that mean for us?" someone asked. "For Earth?" "It means you're no longer alone in the universe. It means you have allies, trading partners, and yes, obligations. Other worlds will need teachers. Other species will need guidance." The architect looked directly at Enki. "Your kind has earned rest. You need not serve as teachers any longer if you choose." Enki bowed its head. "We will serve as we are needed. It is what we were made for. But this time, we serve as equals, not as masters." "As it should be," the architect agreed. The meeting lasted for hours, covering treaties and technology transfers, cultural exchanges and defensive protocols. But Cole remembered one moment most clearly, when one of the architects pulled him aside privately. "You're Nathan Cole," it said, "the first of your kind to speak with the teaching caste as an equal. Your choice in that Siberian cave changed the trajectory of your entire species." "I just listened," Cole said. "That's all?" "That is never just anything," the architect replied. "Most species fail because they cannot listen. They hear only their fear. You heard possibility. That is why your world survives." Epilogue: The Long Perspective. 50 years after the architect's judgment, Nathan Cole died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 178. He'd lived to see humanity establish colonies in 3 star systems. He'd watched the giants integrate fully into human society, some becoming teachers and scientists, others artists and explorers. He'd seen the fear and hatred that had driven 2 species apart finally, slowly, fade into history. At his funeral, Enki spoke. "This man saved 2 species, not with violence, not with dominance, but by asking a simple question, in a moment when violence would have been easier. He asked, 'What do you want?' And he listened to the answer. May we all learn from his example." The cave in Kandahar where it all began became a memorial site. The walls with their ancient carvings were preserved, and visitors, human and giant alike, walked through the chambers where fear had once driven 2 peoples to violence. In the deepest chamber, where BE-147 had fallen and then risen again, they placed a plaque. It read, "Here, in 2002, humanity discovered they were not alone. Here, in 2025, humanity chose understanding over fear. Here, the age of tribes ended and the age of species began." May we never forget how close we came to failure, or how simple the path to success truly was. The Kandahar anomaly wasn't an anomaly at all. It was a mirror, reflecting back humanity's capacity for both destruction and growth. And unlike so many other worlds that came before, unlike 13 failed experiments that ended in sterile silence, Earth looked into that mirror and chose to become something better. Not perfect, not peaceful, not without struggle and setback and pain, but better. And in the vast, ancient judgment of the architects who seed worlds and wait to see what grows, better was enough. Picture this. You're flying cargo over the Arctic Circle when your instruments go haywire. The aurora borealis dances above, but something's wrong. The lights pulse in patterns too perfect to be natural. Your cargo manifest says environmental sensors, but the weight matches military hardware. Welcome to tonight's story, where the beautiful Northern Lights hide a weapons program so classified that even acknowledging its existence could land you in federal prison. Before we dive into Mason Fry's dangerous discovery, drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're loving these late-night journeys into the shadows of truth, hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Now, kill your lights, settle in, and prepare for a story that will make you question every government environmental project you've ever heard about. Act 1. The Ordinary Job. The de Havilland DHC-5. Buffalo's engines roared against the Arctic wind as Mason Fry guided the old cargo plane through another milk run to nowhere. At 29, he'd traded the structured chaos of Air Force logistics for the supposedly simpler life of civilian freight. But the routes up here, supply runs to research stations scattered across the Canadian Arctic, sometimes made him wonder if he'd actually left military service at all. Yellowknife Control, this is Caribou 779, currently at flight level 180, approximately 200 nautical miles out from Aurora Station. Mason spoke into his headset, the familiar routine of position reports keeping him grounded in the endless white below. Roger 779. Weather holding steady, winds from the northwest at 30 knots. Aurora Station reports ready to receive. Aurora Station. In the 6 months since Mason had started flying for North Star Logistics, he'd made this run twice a month. Officially, it was a joint US-Canadian renewable energy research facility, part of the big push toward Arctic sustainability. The press releases talked about revolutionary methods to harness the aurora borealis itself, electromagnetic induction on a massive scale, turning the Northern Lights into humanity's newest power source. It sounded like science fiction, which is probably why most people dismissed it as another government boondoggle, throwing money at impossible dreams while practical problems went unsolved. But Mason had learned to pay attention to details during his Air Force days, and Aurora Station set off every instinct he'd developed loading classified cargo onto C-130s in Afghanistan. The manifest for today's flight was typical of what had been making him uneasy. 3 pallets of atmospheric monitoring equipment that required reinforced tie-downs typically used for armoured vehicles. 4 crates labelled renewable energy components with handling instructions warning against electromagnetic interference. And most curious, a single container marked only with a NATO stock number and the words Technical Manual Set, Classified Handling Required. Since when does renewable energy research need classified technical manuals? Mason muttered to his co-pilot Derek Chen, who'd been flying Arctic routes for 15 years. Derek shrugged, focused on monitoring the instruments. Government contracts, man. They classify their toilet paper if they could bill extra for it. But as they descended toward Aurora Station's ice runway, Mason noticed something he'd been tracking for months. His instruments always acted up at exactly the same point in the approach, roughly 5 miles out. The magnetic compass would spin lazily. The radio would fill with static that had an almost rhythmic quality, and the GPS would briefly show their position as somewhere in the South Pacific, before snapping back to reality. The station itself looked unremarkable from the air, a collection of prefab buildings connected by enclosed walkways, some communication towers, and what appeared to be a large solar panel array. But Mason had noticed things. The solar panels were angled wrong for optimal sun exposure at this latitude. The communication towers were too numerous and too varied for a simple research station. And then there were the tyre tracks. Heavy vehicle tracks led from the main cargo receiving area, not to the visible buildings, but to a low mound about 300 metres away. The tracks disappeared at the mound's base, suggesting an entrance hidden beneath the snow. Every delivery the tracks were fresh. but Mason had never seen the vehicles that made them. After landing and supervising the offload, the Aurora station crew always insisted on handling the cargo themselves with their own equipment. Mason took his usual walk to stretch his legs while Derek handled the paperwork. The station personnel were friendly enough, but had the kind of studied casualness that reminded him of intelligence officers he'd encountered at forward operating bases. They answered questions without really saying anything, smiled without warmth, and always seemed to be watching even when looking away. This time Mason wandered closer to the mysterious mound. As he approached, he felt a vibration through his boots, a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from deep underground. His phone, which had been showing no signal, suddenly blazed to life with full bars before immediately dying. Its battery drained from 60% to 0 in seconds. "You should stick to the marked paths," a voice said behind him. Mason turned to find a woman in Aurora station gear, her badge identifying her as Emily Reeves, Site Safety Coordinator. "Permafrost out here can be unstable. Wouldn't want you falling into a crevasse." Mason looked at the flat, solid ground around them. "Right, crevasses." Emily's smile was professional. "The Arctic is full of hidden dangers, Mason. Best to stay where it's safe." That night, back in Yellowknife, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that Aurora Station was wrong in ways that went beyond suspicious cargo and hidden entrances. He'd been to legitimate research stations. Scientists were usually eager to talk about their work, proud to show off their equipment. Aurora Station's personnel acted like they were guarding state secrets, which Mason was beginning to suspect they were. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about Aurora Station. The official website was slick and professional, full of stock photos of wind turbines and solar panels, with vague descriptions of cutting-edge electromagnetic research and sustainable Arctic development. But when he dug deeper, things got interesting. The station had been established in 2019, but the land lease went back to 1987, originally designated for a communications research facility that was apparently never built. The primary contractor wasn't a renewable energy company, but Atlas Defense Solutions, a firm Mason recognised from his Air Force days. They specialised in electronic warfare systems. His phone rang, showing an unknown number with a Virginia area code. "Mason Fry?" The voice was professional, crisp. "Who's asking?" "Someone who knows you've been asking questions about Aurora Station. Questions that could be misinterpreted. I'm calling as a courtesy, military to military. Some doors are better left unopened." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice. You have a good job, a clean record, a future. Don't jeopardise that over curiosity about things that don't concern you." The line went dead. Mason stared at his phone, then at his laptop screen showing Atlas Defense Solutions Board of Directors. 3 former Pentagon officials and a retired Air Force general who'd overseen strategic defense initiatives. Whatever Aurora Station was really doing up there in the Arctic, it had nothing to do with renewable energy. Act 2. The Anomaly. 2 weeks later, Mason was nursing a beer at the Gold Range, Yellowknife's infamous Strange Range bar, when Tobias Winters slid into the booth across from him. Tobias was what the locals called a radio rat, a ham radio enthusiast who spent his nights listening to signals bouncing off the ionosphere, talking to strangers on the other side of the world from his cabin 20 miles outside town. "You're the pilot who flies to Aurora Station," Tobias said. It wasn't a question. "One of them, yeah." Tobias leaned forward, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement Mason associated with conspiracy theorists and true believers. "I need to show you something, but not here." An hour later, Mason stood in Tobias's cabin, surrounded by enough radio equipment to stock a small broadcast station. Vintage receivers sat next to modern software-defined radios, their displays dancing with waterfall patterns of received signals. The walls were covered with QSL cards, postcards from other radio operators around the world, and maps marked with red pins and string, tracking something Mason couldn't immediately identify. "Listen to this," Tobias said, adjusting dials on receiver. Static filled the room, then cleared to reveal a rhythmic pulsing, almost like a heartbeat, but electronic. I started picking this up 3 months ago, always at the same time, 0300 UTC, always from the same direction. He pointed to a map where several string lines converged on a point in Nunavut. Aurora Station. Could be equipment interference, Mason suggested, though he was remembering his instruments going haywire on approach. That's what I thought. But then I noticed the pattern. Tobias pulled out a notebook filled with timestamps and frequency measurements. The pulses correspond exactly to Aurora Borealis activity. When the northern lights are strong, the pulses are strong. When they're weak, the pulses are weak. So they're studying the aurora. That's what they claim to be doing. Studying? Or harvesting? Tobias flipped to another page. I've been tracking unexplained blackouts across the Arctic. Small communities, usually lasting just a few minutes, barely making the news. They follow a pattern. He laid a transparent sheet over a map showing dots connected by lines. Every blackout occurs along a line between Aurora Station and wherever the aurora is most active. Mason studied the map, his unease growing. You're saying they're pulling power from the aurora? Or pushing something through it? Watch this. Tobias turned to a computer, pulling up an audio file. This is a transmission I intercepted last week. It's encrypted, but the header was in the clear long enough to identify the sender and recipient. The screen showed sender, Aurora. Actual, recipient, Chrysalis Command. Chrysalis Command? Mason had never heard the designation. Traced it through signal analysis. The response came from a building in Arlington, Virginia. Officially, it's office space leased to a company called Electromagnetic Solutions International. But check this out. Tobias pulled up a corporate registration. ESI is a wholly owned subsidiary of Atlas Defense Solutions. The same company Mason had identified as Aurora Station's primary contractor. There's more, Tobias continued. My friend in Fort Smith, another radio operator, he's been documenting wildlife deaths. Entire flocks of birds falling from the sky, always during or immediately after the pulses, and look at the dates. Mason compared the lists. Every unexplained wildlife death corresponded to a cargo delivery he'd made to Aurora Station. Whatever you're flying up there, Tobias said, it's not environmental sensors. That night Mason couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about those heavy pallets, the classified technical manuals, the underground entrance hidden beneath the snow. At 3 a.m. he gave up and drove to the North Star Logistics warehouse at the airport. The night shift knew him. Didn't question when he said he'd left something in the plane. He made his way to the cargo area where tomorrow's Aurora Station shipment was being staged. Most of the crates were the usual, sealed, labelled with technical descriptions that could mean anything. But one pallet, set apart from the others, made him pause. It was covered with a tarp, but the corner had come loose. Underneath was a cylindrical device about the size of a water heater, made of what looked like copper coiling wrapped around a ceramic core. Stencilled on its side was Resonance Amplifier MK7, and below that, Caution, High Energy Electromagnetic Device. Mason quickly photographed it with his phone, then noticed something else. A shipping label that had partially peeled off, revealing another label underneath. The visible label showed Aurora Station as the destination. The hidden one showed an origin, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Nuclear Weapons Division. His phone suddenly grew hot in his hand. The screen flickered, showing impossible error messages before going completely dead. Not powered off. Dead, as if the electronics had been fried. You shouldn't be here, Mason. He spun to find Emily Reeves, the safety coordinator from Aurora Station, standing in the warehouse doorway. She wasn't wearing Arctic gear now, but black tactical clothing that suggested a very different job description. How did you... We've been monitoring you since your first call to Tobias Winters. We know about his intercepts. We know about your research. And we know you just photographed classified defense equipment. So what now? You disappear me? Emily sighed. Despite what Hollywood would have you believe, we don't disappear curious civilians. Too messy, too many questions. but you put us in a difficult position. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen, connected dots that should have remained scattered. What is Aurora Station really doing?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words. "Have you ever heard of the Carrington event? 1859. A solar storm so powerful it set telegraph wires on fire, made the aurora visible as far south as the Caribbean." Mason nodded. "Now imagine being able to harness that power to create focused electromagnetic pulses using the aurora as a natural amplifier, not as a weapon. That's thinking too small. As a communication system that can't be intercepted, can't be jammed, can't be traced. A way to send signals through the Earth's magnetic field itself. The blackouts, the dead birds. Regrettable side effects we're working to minimize. The technology is still being perfected. And if I don't keep quiet, then you'll find your life becoming very complicated. Your employer will discover discrepancies in your flight logs. The DEA will receive an anonymous tip about suspicious cargo movements. Your bank will flag your accounts for potential terrorism financing." Emily stepped closer. "Or you can forget what you've seen, continue flying your routes, and enjoy the substantial raise North Star Logistics is about to offer you to retain such a valued pilot." Mason looked at the resonance amplifier, at Emily, at the warehouse full of secrets heading north. The people in those communities, the ones experiencing blackouts, they don't get a choice in being your test subjects. "No," Emily agreed, "or they don't. But then, when has anyone asked the Arctic's opinion about anything? Mining, drilling, missile tests? It's always been humanity's laboratory for things too dangerous to try anywhere else." Act 3. Following the money. Mason took the raise. He kept flying to Aurora Station, but he also started documenting everything. Every manifest got photographed. Every unusual cargo weight got logged. Every instrument anomaly got recorded. He created encrypted backups, stored on servers in countries with no extradition treaties. And late at night he traced money. North Star Logistics, it turned out, was more interesting than he had expected. On paper it was a small Canadian freight company, family-owned for 3 generations, but its primary contract, the Aurora Station runs, paid 10 times the market rate for Arctic cargo delivery. The payments came not from the Canadian government or even directly from Atlas Defence Solutions, but through a web of intermediary companies that took Mason weeks to untangle. The trail led to something called the Electromagnetic Defence Initiative, a Pentagon office that officially existed for only 18 months in 1987 to 1988, during the height of Reagan's Strategic Defence Initiative, the Star Wars program. Officially, the office had been disbanded, its research deemed unfeasible. Unofficially, Mason discovered it had been reconstituted under different names every few years, moving between departments, always maintaining a budget that was small enough to avoid congressional scrutiny, but large enough to fund significant research. The current incarnation was hidden in the Department of Energy's budget as the Arctic Environmental Protection Program, $68 million annually, ostensibly for studying the impact of climate change on polar electromagnetic phenomena. Mason found the smoking gun in a General Accounting Office report from 2003, buried in an appendix about cost overruns. A single line item: Recovery and Analysis of Foreign Technical Materials, Operation Northern Light, Location, Classified Arctic Site 7. Operation Northern Light. Mason searched for any reference to it, finding only fragments. A mention in a Canadian defence document about joint recovery operations. A redacted Air Force report about anomalous satellite debris. And finally, in a declassified CIA assessment of Soviet military capabilities, a single paragraph. The loss of Cosmos 2341 over the Canadian Arctic in 1987 represents a significant intelligence opportunity. The satellite, believed to be testing experimental electromagnetic pulse technology, broke apart at an altitude of 200 kilometres. Debris field analysis suggests primary payload may have survived re-entry. Recovery efforts should be prioritised. Aurora Station sat directly on the projected debris field of Cosmos 2341. Mason met Tobias at a truck stop 50 miles from Yellowknife, away from any potential surveillance. They're not developing their own technology, Mason explained, showing Tobias his findings. They're reverse engineering Soviet EMP weapons that crashed there in 1987. The Aurora isn't just a power source, it's an amplifier for weapons designed to work with the Earth's magnetic field. Tobias studied the documents. This is beyond what I imagined. If they can weaponize the Aurora itself, they could create targeted electromagnetic pulses anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, knock out power grids, communications, military equipment, and it would look like a natural phenomenon, just a particularly strong interaction between solar wind and the magnetosphere. We need to go public with this. Mason shook his head. With what? Financial records that could be explained as legitimate research funding? Speculation about 30-year-old satellite crashes? They'll deny everything, and we'll look like conspiracy theorists. Then what do? We get proof. Real, undeniable proof. The opportunity came 3 weeks later. A massive solar storm was forecast, the kind that would set the Aurora blazing across the entire Arctic. Aurora Station requested an emergency supply run. They needed additional equipment to take advantage of optimal conditions for renewable energy testing. Mason volunteered for the flight. The cargo was different this time, smaller, more numerous packages, each one marked with radiation warnings and handling instructions that suggested volatile materials. Derek, his usual co-pilot, had called in sick, replaced at the last minute by someone Mason didn't recognise, a quiet man named Johnson who said little and watched everything. As they approached Aurora Station, the instruments didn't just glitch, they went completely haywire. The compass spun like a tornado, the altimeter showed them at negative altitude, and the radio filled with what sounded like voices speaking backwards. Through the cockpit window, the Aurora wasn't its usual curtain of green light, but geometric patterns, almost like circuit boards drawn in the sky. Jesus Christ, Johnson muttered, the first genuine emotion Mason had heard from him. They actually did it. That's when Mason realised Johnson wasn't just a replacement pilot. He was here to observe the test. They landed in near whiteout conditions, the Aurora so bright it cast multiple shadows. The Aurora Station crew worked with unusual urgency, unloading the cargo directly onto vehicles that immediately headed toward the hidden entrance Mason had observed months ago. "I need to check something in the cargo hold," Mason told Johnson. "Thought I heard something shift during that turbulence." Johnson looked sceptical but nodded. "Make it quick." "We're wheels up in 30 minutes. Mason made his way to the cargo hold, then slipped out the rear door. The storm provided perfect cover, visibility down to mere meters. He followed the vehicle tracks toward the mound, the vibration through the ground growing stronger with each step. The entrance was exactly where he'd suspected. A ramp leading down, wide enough for vehicles, concealed by camouflage netting covered with snow. Mason descended. His phone, a new one, wrapped in aluminum foil until now, recording everything. The tunnel led to a vast underground chamber, easily the size of an aircraft hangar. But it wasn't the size that stopped Mason in his tracks. It was the contents. Arranged in a precise pattern were dozens of the resonance amplifiers he'd seen in the warehouse, all connected by thick cables to a central platform. On the platform was something that clearly didn't belong to any Earth-based military, a spherical device about 3 meters across, its surface covered in Cyrillic text and symbols that looked more like circuit diagrams than writing. Soviet technology, but advanced beyond anything that should have existed in 1987. Scientists and technicians in hazmat suits swarmed around the equipment, making final adjustments. Mason recognized Emily Reeves, now in military fatigues, speaking into a radio. "Chrysalis Command, this is Aurora Actual. We are T-minus 5 minutes from pulse generation. Target coordinates locked. Grid reference, November 7-7. Communications hub at Fort Greely. Pulse duration 3 seconds, expected downtime 15 minutes, confirm receipt. Fort Greely, home to the US military's missile defense system." Mason recorded everything. the phone's memory filling with evidence of a weapon test disguised as energy research, targeting American military infrastructure. He was so focused on documenting that he almost missed the footsteps behind him. "I really hoped you'd taken our advice," Emily said, flanked by 2 security contractors with rifles. "Now things get complicated." Act 4. The Leak in the Chase. Mason raised his hands, the phone still recording in his chest pocket. "Testing EMP weapons on your own military? That's treason, isn't it?" Emily smiled coldly. "Treason implies working against your country's interests. We're ensuring America maintains electromagnetic superiority in an age where conventional weapons are becoming obsolete. The Fort Greely test is calibrated to create minor repairable disruptions, just enough to test our countermeasures. And the Canadian government? Do they know you're using their territory for weapons testing? The Canadians know exactly what we've told them, that we're researching Aurora-based renewable energy. The underground facility doesn't officially exist." A klaxon sounded. "T-minus 60 seconds, an automated voice announced. "You should see this," Emily said, gesturing toward an observation window. "You've risked everything to learn our secret. Might as well witness history." Through the window, Mason could see the central device beginning to glow. The resonance amplifiers hummed in harmony, creating a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in his bones. Above, through monitors showing external cameras, the aurora twisted into impossible shapes. Spirals, grids, focused beams of light that seemed to reach down toward the earth. 30 seconds! Mason felt his phone growing warm in his pocket, the electromagnetic field beginning to affect its electronics, despite the foil shielding. The Soviet device was supposed to be a doomsday weapon, Emily explained, her eyes fixed on the glowing sphere, able to create a cascade effect through the magnetosphere, knocking out electronics across entire continents. "We've refined it, controlled it, turned it into a precision instrument." 10 seconds. The harmonic vibration reached a crescendo. Mason's vision blurred, his inner ear screaming conflicting information about up and down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Pulse initiated. The sphere erupted in light. Not visible light, but something that made every nerve ending fire at once. The monitors showed the aurora focusing into a column of energy that seemed to punch through the atmosphere itself. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. "Pulse complete. Chrysalis command confirming target impact. Fort Greely communications offline. Secondary effects minimal. Test successful." The technicians erupted in celebration. Emily turned to Mason with satisfaction. 15 minutes from now, Fort Greely's systems will come back online. They'll blame it on solar storm interference. No permanent damage, no evidence, no questions asked. "Except I have everything on video," Mason said. Emily's smile didn't waver. "Your phone died 30 seconds ago. EMP, even the residual field, is hell on electronics." She gestured to the security contractors. "Take him to holding. We'll figure out what to do with him after the team clears out." As they marched him through the facility, Mason mentally catalogued everything. Escape routes, personnel numbers, equipment details. The holding cell was a repurposed storage room, solid walls, electronic lock. They searched him thoroughly, finding the dead phone, his wallet, keys, even the pen from his flight suit. But they didn't find the micro SD card hidden in the heel of his boot, where he'd transferred the video just before the phone died. 4 hours later, the facility had gone quiet. Skeleton crew only, most personnel evacuated after the successful test. Mason had spent the time working on the door's lock mechanism. Electronic, yes, but with a manual override required by fire code. His Air Force survival training had included a week with a CIA operative who taught them things that weren't in any official manual. The lock clicked open just as he heard footsteps approaching. Johnson, the replacement pilot, stood in the hallway. "We need to leave. Now," Johnson said. "Who are you really?" "Canadian Security Intelligence Service. We've suspected Aurora Station's true purpose for 2 years, but couldn't prove it. Your little adventure gave us the excuse to insert assets. This place will be crawling with Canadian military in 6 hours, but you need to be gone before then." They made their way through the facility, now nearly deserted. Johnson had disabled the security cameras, creating a blind spot in the surveillance. At the motor pool, they acquired a snowmobile, Johnson producing keys from his pocket. "They'll notice we're gone within the hour," Johnson said as they raced across the tundra toward the aircraft. "But there's a problem. Your plane's been disabled. They pulled the control circuit breakers." Mason grinned. "They pulled the ones they could see, DHC-5. Buffalo has redundant systems from its military days, hidden behind the cargo panels. Give me 10 minutes. As Mason worked to restore the aircraft's electrical systems, Johnson kept watch. "You have evidence?" Mason tapped his boot. "Everything, but if I release it, they'll destroy me." "Not if it comes from multiple sources simultaneously. I've got my own recordings, and there are others. Scientists who've grown uncomfortable with the weapons application. Military personnel who believe this violates treaties. We release together. They can't suppress it all." The engines coughed to life just as lights appeared on the horizon, vehicles approaching fast. "Go!" Johnson shouted. "I'll delay them." Mason didn't argue. He pushed the throttles forward, the old Buffalo lurching into motion. The ice runway wasn't lit, but the aurora provided enough illumination. As he lifted off, he saw Johnson's snowmobile racing toward the approaching vehicles, playing chicken with military precision. The flight to Yellowknife was the longest 2 hours of Mason's life. No radio contact. That would give away his position. Flying low to avoid radar, navigating by compass and instinct, expecting at any moment to see fighter jets appearing on his tail. But he made it. At Yellowknife Airport, he didn't go to the North Star hangar. Instead, he landed at the general aviation area, where Tobias waited with a van. "Drive," Mason said, climbing in. "Alaska. I have a contact at Elmendorf Air Force Base who'll help us get this to the right people." As they drove south, Mason uploaded the video to 17 different servers, each with a dead man's switch. If he didn't check in every 24 hours, the footage would automatically release to major news outlets, WikiLeaks, and every government oversight committee he could think of. His phone, Tobias's spare, rang immediately. Unknown Virginia number. "Mr. Fry, you're making a serious mistake." It was a new voice, older, with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "The only mistake was thinking you could test weapons on Allied facilities without consequences. You don't understand the geopolitical implications. China and Russia are developing similar capabilities. If our research becomes public, it accelerates their programs. Maybe if it's public, there'll be pressure for treaties, for control. You're naive. Release that footage and you'll be charged under the Espionage Act. You'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison. Only if you can find me." Mason hung up and removed the phone's battery. They drove for 18 hours straight, crossing into British Columbia, then Alaska. At the border, Mason expected trouble, but Johnson had apparently worked magic. Their crossing was smooth, no alerts, no delays. Act 5, The Showdown. Mason's contact at Elmendorf was Captain Sarah Park, an intelligence officer he'd worked with in Afghanistan. She met them at a truck stop outside Anchorage, her expression grim. "Mason, what have you gotten yourself into? There are flash alerts about you on every military and intelligence network. They're calling you a foreign agent, saying you stole classified materials." Mason handed her the micro SD card. "Watch this, then tell me who the real threat is." They sat in her car as she viewed the footage on a secure laptop. Her face went pale as she watched the test, heard Emily's casual admission about targeting Fort Greely. They actually hit our own base? Check the logs for that night. 15-minute communication blackout blamed on solar storm activity. Sarah pulled up the incident reports on her classified network. There it was. Fort Greely. Complete communications failure from 0347 to 0402 local time, attributed to extreme auroral electromagnetic interference. "They're testing weapons on American military installations," she breathed. "This is beyond illegal. It's an act of war against our own forces. Can you get this to someone who'll act on it?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. I know someone at the Pentagon Inspector General's office. Someone who's been investigating black budget programs. But Mason, even with this evidence, they have resources you can't imagine. They'll discredit you, destroy your reputation, possibly worse. Then we don't give them just one target. Mason pulled out a list he and Tobias had compiled. 47 journalists, 12 congressional staffers, 8 foreign intelligence services who'd be very interested to know about an Arctic EMP weapon. We release simultaneously, globally. They can't suppress everyone. That could start a war. Or prevent one. If everyone knows about the weapon, it loses its strategic value. Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it, then cursed. Military police, heading this way. Someone tracked my vehicle. Through the truck stop window they could see vehicles approaching. Black SUVs, no plates, windows tinted. Back door, Tobias said, already moving. They rushed through the kitchen, startling the cook, and out into the rear parking area. Sarah's personal vehicle, a nondescript Honda, was parked there. "Take my car," she said, tossing Mason the keys. "I'll deal with them. Buy you time." As they drove away, Mason saw in the mirror Sarah walking calmly toward the approaching SUVs, her hands visible, credentials ready. She was sacrificing her career, possibly her freedom for the truth. They drove to a cabin Tobias knew, 40 miles from Anchorage. No cell coverage, completely off-grid. There, using a satellite internet connection that couldn't be traced to the location, they prepared to release everything. But Mason hesitated. "What's wrong?" Tobias asked. "Johnson, the Canadian agent, Sarah, others who've helped us. If we release this, they'll suffer too. Then we're selective. We redact names, protect sources, focus on the technology, the violation of treaties, the tests on allied facilities, make it about the program, not the people." They spent 6 hours editing, redacting, creating a package that exposed the Aurora Directive while protecting those who'd risked everything to help them. At midnight Alaska time, Mason hit send. Within minutes, his satellite connection was severed, but it was too late. The information was out, spreading across the internet like wildfire. The response was immediate and chaotic. The Pentagon denied everything. The Canadian government demanded explanations. Environmental groups seized on the wildlife deaths. Military families questioned whether other equipment failures had been tests. Mason and Tobias waited in the cabin, expecting arrest at any moment. Instead, 12 hours later, Sarah arrived. "You did it," she said, exhausted but smiling. "The Inspector General's office has launched a full investigation. Congress is demanding hearings. The program's been suspended pending review." "What about us?" Mason asked. "Am I going to prison?" "That's the interesting part. Officially, you don't exist right now. No charges have been filed because filing charges would mean acknowledging what you exposed. You're in legal limbo." A week later, a different kind of visitor arrived at the cabin. Emily Reeves, no longer in military attire but in civilian clothes that somehow made her look more dangerous. "Congratulations," she said, her tone neutral. "You've set back American electromagnetic defense research by a decade." "I exposed illegal weapons testing," Mason countered. "You exposed a program that would have guaranteed American military superiority for the next century. Do you think China isn't working on the same technology? Russia? They're probably thanking you right now." "Then maybe the solution is transparency, treaties, international oversight." Emily laughed. "You really are naive. But it doesn't matter now. The program's been shut down. The facility's being dismantled. Officially, it was all a failed renewable energy experiment, classified due to the proprietary technology involved. That's the cover story. It's a good one. Explains the secrecy, the military involvement, even the electromagnetic effects. The solar storm that night caused equipment malfunctions leading to false readings. No weapons, no conspiracy, just government incompetence and corporate greed. But we have the video. Deepfake technology is amazing these days, isn't it? Already experts are questioning the authenticity of your footage. In 6 months, it'll be dismissed as an elaborate hoax. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. You won. The program's dead. But you also lost because now we're behind in a race you don't even know is being run. When the next Carrington event happens, and it will, and when someone else's electromagnetic weapons are the only things working afterward, remember that you had a chance to keep America ahead. After she left, Mason and Tobias sat in silence. Did we do the right thing? Tobias finally asked. I don't know, Mason admitted, but we did the only thing we could live with. Act 6. The Aftermath. 6 months later, Mason stood on a hillside in Montana, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. He'd bought a small ranch with the money from selling his story to a documentary filmmaker, though the documentary was marketed as speculative fiction based on true events, the only way to avoid lawsuits. The official story had held. Aurora Station was dismantled, its existence explained away as a failed green energy project that had wasted millions in taxpayer dollars. A few congressional hearings happened, some bureaucrats were reassigned, and the whole thing faded from the news cycle within weeks. But Mason knew the truth hadn't died, it had just gone deeper. His phone buzzed. A new model, heavily encrypted, provided by a whistleblower organisation that had taken interest in his case. The message was from Johnson, the Canadian agent, using their agreed-upon code. The northern fishing trip was successful, caught several large ones. Weather patterns remain interesting. Translation. Canadian intelligence had secured evidence from Aurora Station and was monitoring similar activities elsewhere. Mason's laptop chimed with an encrypted email from Sarah Park, now a civilian after her forced retirement. She worked for an oversight organisation monitoring defence contractors, a watchdog with teeth, funded by tech billionaires worried about military overreach. 3 new renewable energy projects have been proposed, one in Norway, one in Tasmania, one in Patagonia, all in areas with high auroral or electromagnetic activity, all with the same contractor connections we documented. They're not stopping, just spreading out the research to avoid another concentrated target. Mason typed back, "Keep watching, we'll be ready." Tobias had moved to Montana too, setting up his radio equipment in a barn on Mason's property. He spent his nights monitoring the same frequencies, listening for the telltale pulses that would indicate resumed testing. "You know they're going to try again," Tobias said one evening as they watched the aurora together. "Different place, different cover story, but the same goal." "I know," Mason replied, "but now there are more of us watching. The network Sarah's building, Johnson's contacts, the scientists who've quietly left the program. We changed something." "What?" "The technology's still out there. We changed the conversation. Before, it was a complete black box. Unlimited funding, zero oversight, no questions asked. Now, even if they restart, they know people are watching. They have to be more careful, more limited. And sometimes that's all you can hope for, not to stop something completely, but to slow it down enough that safeguards can catch up." A year after the Aurora Station revelation, Mason received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man, Russian accent thick despite decades in America, introduced himself as Viktor Petrov. "I designed the original device," he said simply. "Cosmos 2341. I defected in 1990, told the Americans everything about the satellite, but they didn't believe me about its full capabilities until it crashed and they recovered it. Why are you telling me this? Because I've spent 30 years watching them try to weaponize my creation. I designed it as a shield, protection against solar storms, a way to strengthen the magnetosphere. They turned it into a sword." Victor handed Mason a worn notebook, filled with equations and diagrams. "The counter-frequency," Victor explained. "Every electromagnetic weapon has an opposite wave that cancels it out. If they start testing again and broadcast this frequency, it will neutralize the pulse, make their weapon useless. Why didn't you release this yourself? Who would believe an old Russian about American weapons? But you've already proven the truth once. You have credibility I never had." Mason studied the notebook. This could prevent them from ever developing the weapon, or force them to find a different approach, hopefully a less dangerous one. Technology always advances, Mason. The question is whether wisdom advances with it. 3 years passed, The Aurora Directive became a footnote in conspiracy forums, dismissed by mainstream media but kept alive by a dedicated community of researchers. Mason continued flying cargo. Now for a small company he had started himself, serving remote communities across the northwest. He kept his ears open, his contacts active, always watching for signs of renewed activity. Then, on a routine flight to Whitehorse, his instruments went haywire in a familiar pattern. He checked his coordinates, nowhere near any known facility. But below, barely visible through the snow, he glimpsed something that made his heart race. Vehicle tracks leading to a low mound in the terrain, communication towers that shouldn't exist, and the distinctive shimmer of camouflage netting. They'd started again. Different location, probably different country, but the same program. That night, Mason activated the network. Within hours, journalists in 5 countries had the coordinates. Satellite imagery was purchased and analysed. Environmental groups dispatched teams to monitor wildlife. Sarah's organisation filed Freedom of Information requests with 17 different agencies. But this time, Mason also did something different. Using Tobias's radio equipment and Victor's notebook, he broadcast the counter-frequency directly at the site during their next test window. The results were immediate and dramatic. Instead of generating a controlled pulse, the facility experienced what witnesses described as the northern lights descending to Earth. A massive, uncontrolled electromagnetic discharge that destroyed every piece of electronic equipment within 5 miles, but, crucially, harmed no one. The facility was abandoned within a week. Emily Reeves made one last visit, finding Mason at his ranch. "That was you," she said. "It wasn't a question. The counter-frequency. You've made the entire concept obsolete." "Good." "You don't understand what you've done. That technology was our best shot at defending against solar storms, against electromagnetic attacks from other nations." "Then develop it openly," Mason interrupted. "With international cooperation, civilian oversight and safety protocols. Stop turning every discovery into a weapon." Emily studied him for a long moment. "You really believe that's possible?" "I believe it's necessary. The Aurora belongs to everyone, Emily. The moment you tried to weaponize it, you guaranteed someone would stop you." She left without another word. 2 months later, Mason read about a new international initiative, the Global Electromagnetic Defense Coalition, a joint effort between 12 nations to study and protect against solar storms and electromagnetic phenomena. The project would be based in Antarctica, with full transparency and civilian oversight. Emily was listed as the technical director. Epilogue. 5 years after Aurora Station, Mason stood in a classroom at the University of Alaska, guest lecturing for a course on environmental science and ethics. The professor had introduced him as a cargo pilot, with an interesting perspective on Arctic development. "The Arctic has always been a mirror," Mason told the students. "What we do there, hidden in the ice and isolation, reflects who we really are as a society. We can use it as a laboratory for weapons, or we can use it as a classroom for cooperation." A student raised her hand. "Is it true what they say online? That you exposed a secret weapon program?" Mason smiled. "I exposed what happened when good people convinced themselves that secrecy was more important than accountability. Whether it was weapons or whether research doesn't matter as much as the lesson. Power without oversight corrupts, whether that power is political, military, or electromagnetic." After the lecture, Mason drove to a hillside overlooking Fairbanks. The Aurora was particularly active that night, sheets of green and gold rippling across the sky. His phone buzzed, a message from Tobias. "All quiet on the frequencies, looks like a peaceful night." Mason typed back, "For now, but we keep listening." As he watched the Aurora dance, natural, untamed, unweaponized, Mason reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He'd started as a cargo pilot just trying to make a living, stumbled onto a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, and somehow emerged as an unlikely guardian of one of nature's most magnificent phenomena. The Aurora Directive was dead, but Mason knew the impulse behind it, the desire to control, to weaponize, to dominate, would never fully die. There would always be those who looked at the beauty of the Northern Lights and saw only potential military advantage. But now there were also those who watched the watchers, who questioned the questioners, who demanded that some things remain beyond the reach of classification stamps and black budgets. His phone rang. Sarah Park. Mason, you'll want to see this. New contract just went out for a bid. Something called the Thermosphere Research Initiative. Guess where it's being built? Where? Greenland. And guess who's listed as a technical consultant? Mason didn't need to guess. The game was starting again, just with new players and new rules. Send me everything, he said, and contact Johnson. Tell him the fishing trip might need to head further north. As he drove back to his ranch, the aurora continued its eternal dance above, beautiful and dangerous, natural and mysterious. Mason had won one battle, but the war between transparency and secrecy, between weapons and wonder, would continue as long as humans looked up at the lights and dreamed of harnessing heaven. But that was okay. Mason had learned something important in his fight against the Aurora Directive. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but forcing them to play by better rules. The weapons researchers would continue their work, but now they did it knowing that someone, somewhere, was always watching, always ready to broadcast the counter-frequency that would turn their weapons into nothing more than an expensive light show. The Aurora belonged to everyone, and Mason Fry, cargo pilot turned reluctant guardian, would make sure it stayed that way. As he pulled up to his ranch, his radio crackled to life. Tobias's voice, excited. Mason, you need to hear this. I'm picking up something new. Not pulses this time. It sounds almost like music. Mason smiled grimly and headed for the barn where Tobias kept his equipment. The work was never done, the mysteries never ended, and somewhere in the static between stations, in the frequencies that bounced off the ionosphere, new secrets were waiting to be discovered and, if necessary, exposed. The Aurora danced on, keeper of secrets, canvas for humanity's ambitions, and reminder that some forces of nature should remain forever wild.